Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens. This week, for our special 50th edition of the Stars and Swords podcast, we're going to finish up our discussion of the destruction of the trees, we're going to finish up our discussion of the darkening of Valinor, and then we're going to push into the flight of the Noldor in Chapter 9 of the Silmarillion. We have a lot of material to get to today, so I apologize in advance if you're not going to be seeing so much of my face, because there's not really space on these slides for my little picture-in-picture camera box. That, of course, only applies to you, to those of you watching live or after the fact on YouTube, which you can, of course, always do. We have some business to get to before we get into this week's reading, however, because we have a couple of quick updates, the most important of which is the result of the poll that we ran after last week's show to determine by which name this fellowship might be called. A proper collective term for, and I'm just now realizing, is it a collective term for you guys, or is it a collective term for all of us? I'm going to say it's a collective term for all of us. I'm going to invite myself to this party, and if that's not cool, then you can let me know in the comments after the fact. But I'm glad to announce that the voting was very close. Ardent Readers, Eloquenta, and Numenorians all came in a joint third place, and Aina Lindeliers took second, which means hail and well met, fellow Silmarillionaires. Thanks to Wayne for that recommendation. Now we have a name. It's becoming a real thing. I'm so proud of us all. The second thing that I wanted to mention, starting this week, I have a couple of new short form video projects which are Tolkien related, which are going to be going out on the Stars and Swords YouTube page, the Instagram page for now at least, and over on Blue Sky if I can figure out the technical impediments to making that thing work. And I don't normally, talk about my social media stuff right here at the top of the show because I'm very bad at self-promotion. It's a thing that you have to know about me. Passionate about Tolkien, drinker of coffee and scotch, very bad at self-promotion. These are the things which define me. Those would pop up. If this was an RPG, those would pop up as my primary traits or characteristics. But this isn't just asking for follows and shares and recommendations and all of that kind of stuff. I'm actually producing content over there, original content that is distinct from, but obviously related to the Silmarillion content that we're currently doing here on Stars and Swords. So if you haven't yet stopped by the YouTube page, the Instagram page, the Blue Sky page, then please do, because there's going to be cool stuff coming out within the next couple days. The first is going to be of particular interest if you, like I, happen to be a fan of the Ents of Middle-earth. More on that in the week. Thirdly, I have finally set up a bookstore. I always want to say bookstore. I should lean into my British roots. A bookshop.org page for Stars and Swords. Bookshop.org is a cool a collaborative page which allows basically the distribution of your book needs, your book appetites to local bookstores all around the country. You can go to the page, you can select a local bookstore that you particularly like, and then you can buy your books mediated by bookshop.org. And the books will come to you via your local bookstore, your local bookseller, rather than a hideous Titanic international monolith. There was another word I was going for there, but I didn't get to it. So monolith will do for now. I'm very caffeinated this afternoon. It's a Sunday afternoon recording, and I'm feeling a little frantic and ragged edged here, but it's going to be good. We're going to settle in just a moment to the action of Fëanor. So all of that is to say that the link to the bookshop.org page will now be in the show notes. Right now, it's just a list of the 10 books that we have covered so far in formal units here, but I am going to add another list over there for attendant texts and for things that we've discussed in passing, things we've covered in bonus episodes I think could be really good. Our next bonus episode is, of course, on the first of the Murderbot Diaries series, so I'll make that available over there too. You'll be able to click through and support a local bookstore for a small nominal fee over the cost of buying it from Amazon or other online retailers. But it really is a great service, and it's a service that I use all the time, so I really wanted to make that available to you guys. And I think, is that it? I think that is it. Yes, that's all of the information that we have so far. That's all of the updates and errata and outstanding business. Let's get to it. Previously, on the Silmarillion, Fëanor was exiled from the cities of Valmar and Tirion upon Tuna for drawing his sword on his half-brother Fingolfin. So he goes north and he builds the fortress of Formenos with his 7 sons and his father, Finwë, king of the Noldor. Acting as king of the Noldor right now is Finwë's second son, Fingolfin, in Tirion upon Tuna, of course. Melkor then goes to Formenos, tries to sow further discord amongst the Noldor and between the Noldor and the Valar too, but Fëanor tells him to get gone, so Melkor pretends to flee north, but secretly goes south into the lightless strands of Avathar, where he finds Ungoliant and recruits her. I've relapsed there into my old pronunciation. That was cute. Ungoliant, of course, there in the lightless strands of Avathar. And I wanted to begin this week by actually presenting for you, because I don't think that many people have read or potentially will read this book, but I wanted to pull the alternate version of the introduction of Ungoliant from Morgoth's Ring, which is the 10th volume of the History of Middle-earth, just because it gives us an insight, a further insight potentially into the relationship between Melkor, soon to be Morgoth, and Ungoliant as we move into this week's reading, because it can be difficult, I think, to understand exactly their relationship and exactly their power differential. And without that understanding, some things which may be fantastic will come off as perhaps a little less fantastic than they would otherwise be. So we're going to drop in here and take a look at this slide. If I can make this work. Here we are from Morgoth's Ring, The History of Middle-earth, Volume 10. In a ravine she lived and wove her black webs in a cleft of the mountains. All light she sucked up and spun it forth in dark nets of gloom. But now she was famished and in great torment, for all living things had fled far away, and her own webs shut out from her all light that could come to her dwelling, whether through passes in the walls of Aman or from the heavens above. Yet she had no longer the strength or will to depart. Now Melkor sought for her, and he put on again that form that he had worn as the tyrant of Autumno, a dark lord, tall and terrible. In that form he remained ever after. And when Ungoliant saw him coming, she was afraid. Knowing his hatred for all who tried to escape from him, she shrank into her deepest lair and tried to shroud herself in new shadow. But such darkness as in her famine she could weave was no defense against the eyes of Melkor, lord of Autumno and Angband. Come forth, he said, thrice fool, to leave me first to dwell here languishing within reach of feasts untold, and now to shun me, giver of gifts, thy only hope. Come forth and see, I have brought thee an earnest of greater bounty to follow. But Ungoliant made no answer, and retreated deeper into the cloven rock. Then Melkor was angered, for he was in haste, having reckoned his times to a nicety. Come out, he cried, I have need of thee, and will not be denied. Either thou wilt serve me, or I will bury thee here, and under black stone thou shalt wither into naught. Then suddenly he held up in his hands 2 shining gems. They were green, and in that lightless place they reflected the dreadful light of his eyes, as if some ravenous beast had come hunting there. Thus the great thief set his lure for the lesser. Slowly Ungoliant came forth, but as she drew near Melkor withheld the lure. Nay, nay, he said, I do not bring thee these elvish sweets in love or in pity. They are to strengthen thee when thou hast agreed to do my bidding. What is your bidding, master? She said, and her eyes gloated upon the gems. So, a very compatible version of the story with the version that's given to us in the finished Silmarillion, but with a little more information here, right? We have this idea. First, we get a lot more characterization for Melkor. We get more dialogue from Melkor, which is very helpful. We also get this positioning of Melkor as the Dark Lord of Autumno and Angband, both of which are going to be immediately relevant, are going to recur in the text in the pages to come. That's a helpful reminder of who he once was. But really, we also get, of course, brilliantly the foreshadowing of Giver of Gifts. That is going to be very relevant when we get to later parts of this story. Melkor will not be the only person associated with gifts in the pages of the Silmarillion. So he goes to Ungoliant there. You know, I remember talking about this last week. This is the more formally Quenya name of Ungoliant. This is how it was rendered in some of the initial writings. This is all from the second phase. This is Tolkien's big second attempt at getting these stories down on paper. So Ungoliant is that more formal Quenya name, which Christopher then decides to drop out of the Silmarillion to replace it with the more familiar Ungoliant, which was used in the pages of The Lord of the Rings, of course. So we see here a completely different dynamic than the one that might be implied by the formal version of this account that we get in the pages of the Silmarillion, because we see an Ungoliant here more wretched, and we see, if anything, a Melkor more powerful. There's always that sense when you read this account in the Silmarillion proper that there's almost a meeting of equals here, right? Ungoliant is extremely powerful, for sure, but she's kind of meeting Melkor where he is, and that's clearly not what's happening in this older version of the story. As he comes forth here, thrice fool, to leave me first, to dwell here languishing within reach of feasts untold, and now to shun me. So she, who craves, who needs, who wants to feast upon light, but also, crucially, fears it, right? We're presented with a much more wretched creature here, far to the south of Amun. And I think it's very tempting, if you're so inclined, to see some commonality here with Gollum residing under the Misty Mountains, right? There's almost a quality of being desirous. There's a quality of jealousy, right? Jealousy as distinct from envy. Jealousy wants you to hoard the thing that you possess, to keep it entirely for yourself, and to retreat from the world. And this inevitably is what happens. As you retreat from the world, you become a darker, more wretched, more pitiful creature in some sense, but also less powerful, less possessed of your full faculty, as has clearly happened here to Ungoliante. So Melkor comes to her and offers her these gems, these two glowing gems, presumably taken from Valinor, but he's giving them to her now, these elvish sweets, which is one of my favorite turns of phrase that Tolkien has in all of Morgoth's Ring, which is just fantastic. I do not bring thee these elvish sweets in love or in pity. They are to strengthen thee when thou hast agreed to do my bidding. So this is crucial, that we're getting the idea that Melkor is empowering Ungoliant as we are preparing for the assault on Valinor itself. This is going to pay off in the pages of the Silmarillion that we get, but we don't really get this part of the initial account in advance of the darkening of Valinor. We'll get into, of course, Chapter 9 as we move forward. So that's our meeting between Melkor and Ungoliante there in the strands of Avathar. Meanwhile, Manwë and the other Valar, not exactly meanwhile, right? Because it's 3 Vailian years later. So it's like almost a decade later, in fact, by our reckoning of time. But still, that's almost immediate for the Valar of Valinor, right? Manwë and the other Valar decide to heal the rifts between the elves and to undo the damage caused by Melkor by throwing the giant harvest festival at Taniquetil. Fëanor is specifically commanded to appear, and he does, though he remains characteristically sulky throughout, right? Fingolfin forgives his half-brother for drawing his sword and pledges to be half-brother in blood, full brother in heart, thereby setting the stage for innumerable tragedies to come, most of which we'll discuss this week, or at least the beginning of which we'll discuss this week. Melkor and Ungoliant, meanwhile, have been sneaking north through Valinor, shrouded in the unlight of Ungoliant. I'm everywhere with my pronunciation this week, everywhere but the right place. The cloud of Ungoliant that we'll get in just a page or two. They go to Valmar, they go to Exalahar, they go to the mound upon which the trees grow. And then we begin the darkening of Valinor proper. Glorfin David appears in the chat. Hi, Glorfin David. I hadn't noticed that for a little bit now, but hi, it's good to have you with us. Let's get into, then, the actual disaster, the actual darkening of Valinor. It is told that even as Fëanor and Fingolfin stood before Manwë, there came the mingling of lights when both trees were shining, and the silent city of Valmar was filled with a radiance of silver and gold. And in that very hour, Melkor and Ungoliant came hastening over the fields of Valinor, as the shadow of a black cloud upon the wind fleets over the sunlit earth. And they came before the green mound Zelahar. Then the unlight of Ungoliant rose up even to the roots of the trees, and Melkor sprang upon the mound, and with his black spear he smote each tree to its core, wounded them deep, and their sap poured forth as if it were their blood, and was spilled upon the ground. But Ungoliant sucked it up, and going then from tree to tree, she set her black beak to their wounds till they were drained, and the poison of death that was in her went into their tissues and withered them, root, branch, and leaf, and they died. And still she thirsted, and going to the wells of Varda, she drank them dry. But Ungoliant belched forth black vapors as she drank, and swelled to a shape so vast and hideous that Melkor was afraid. Tolkien spoiling us with 2 of those characteristically punchy terminal phrases, right? Just delivering a wave, a wash of detail and of narrative, and then wrapping it up with something so powerful, right? As we get this description of Ungoliant feasting upon the light of the trees, and then we get the withering, withered them root, branch, and leaf, and they died. And then we get, and Melkor was afraid. We're not going to often talk about Melkor being afraid, but I think we talked about this in advance last time and then didn't get to it. Melkor is noted, will be noted, eventually when facing off against Fingolfin, in fact. Melkor will be noted as the only one of the Valar to ever feel fear, yeah. Yes, Becky says, I thought you said last time that each Valinorian year was like 9 or 10 regular years. Yes, 9.5-ish. Did I just do some math badly right at the beginning of this show? 3 years, 3 years would be like, no, you're right, 30 years, not a decade. Why was I multiplying by 3? Thank you, Becky, for correcting the math here. Not my strong suit, I have to say. Though normally I can handle, basic arithmetic. But you're completely right. Yes, 30 years almost between Melkor recruiting Ungoliant on the strands south of Aman there, and then the assault on Valinor itself. And you'll remember that all of this is taking place during the exile of Fëanor, right? Fëanor's not supposed to be in Valinor proper. He's supposed to be north in Formanus. He's supposed to be exiled, but he is specifically recalled. And I'm mentioning that mostly so that when we begin to unpick everything that happens after this terrible event, that is one thing to bear in mind, right? That this judgment is laid upon Fëanor, that he is exiled from Valinor, And then he breaks that, albeit at the command of Manwë. And we have to question, perhaps, whether there's any culpability here on Manwë's part, too, right? Whether there's anything happening here that we should read as a failure to fulfill a deemed word, right? A failure to absolutely deliver on a judgment that was passed by the Valar. One more thing amidst the 20 things that could account for everything that goes wrong from this point forward. Let's keep going here with our next slide and the great darkness falling across Valinor. So the great darkness fell upon Valinor. Of the deeds of that day, much is told in the Aldudeniae that Elamire of the Vanyar made and is known to all the Eldar. Yet no song or tale could contain all the grief and terror that then befell. The light failed, and the darkness that followed was more than loss of light. In that hour was made a darkness that seemed not lack, but a thing with being of its own. For it was indeed made by malice out of light, and it had power to pierce the eye, and to enter heart and mind, and strangle the very will. Varda looked down from Taniquetil, and beheld the shadow soaring up in sudden towers of gloom. Valmar had foundered in a deep sea of night. Soon the holy mountain stood alone, a last island in a world that was drowned. All song ceased. There was silence in Valinor, and no sound could be heard, save only from afar that came on the wind through the pass of the mountains, the wailing of the Teleri, like the cold cry of gulls. For it blew chill from the east in that hour, and the vast shadows of the sea were rolled against the walls of the shore. But Manwë from his high seat looked out, and his eyes alone pierced through the night, until they saw a darkness beyond dark which they could not penetrate, huge but far away, moving now northward with great speed, and he knew that Melkor had come and gone. One of those moments here where Tolkien really leverages the power of the documentary history, the textual history of the stories as they're presented to us by referencing other stories, which in this case don't exist. There is no Aldudeniae that we know of. There was never a document of that name or of that type that was written by Tolkien. He's gesturing to a part of this kind of paratextual imaginary that surrounds the documents that we actually have compiled into the Silmarillion and into the other books of Middle-earth, too. There is no Elamire of the Vanyar. That character name does not recur. We don't really know anything about Elamire. The formulation of Elamire's name doesn't even allow us to gender Elamire at this point. So it's just a nod outward. It's just a gesture toward the complexity that lays beyond. But it also allows us to position this narrative in a much more declarative mode, because otherwise, if you were simply recounting the story of the darkening of Valinor in its entirety, you would want more detail. You would want more function. You would want more consequence. You would need more direct happenstance as it's occurring, right? We want to know what is happening to the Valar, what is happening to the Noldor, what is happening to the Vanyar, what is happening to all of the many residents of Valinor here, the animals of Valinor. What happens? Well, actually, you already know what happens, because it's told in the Aldudeniae, and Elamire of the Vanyar wrote that so that it could be enjoyed by all of the Eldar. That is a story that everyone knows, so we're not going to recount it here, which for us, the modern reader, positions this text as something mythological, for sure, but also leaves us this huge interpretive space for us to populate with our own imagination, for us to fill with our own belief as we move forward. Yeah, Glorfin David's calling out here. Yes, Aldudeniae, world building, absolutely. Yeah, not the only time that we're going to get this. In this week's reading, oh, I don't remember when we get the mention of the other great story. But of course, in a few weeks' time, we're going to be talking about the Lays of Beleriand, and we're going to be building out stories left and right as we move back to the Sindar and the dwarves, too, in the pages to come. So the first thing that happens is Melkor smites the trees. He buries his black spear into the trees, and their sap runs forth like blood. Ungoliant, drinks that light, then feasts upon the light collected in the vats by Varda, right? You'll remember that Varda collects that light, uses some of it to create the new night sky, to create the new stars and constellations ahead of the awakening of the children of Iluvatar, but obviously lots is left over, and perhaps this is even a security precaution, right? Even if the trees are somehow destroyed, even if Melkor somehow destroys the trees, then at least we still have the light, and we're going to be told later that maybe that light would have been enough to, in some sense, reconstruct the trees, that we would have been able to persist as we were not able to persist after the casting down of the lamps so many thousands of years ago at this point. But the darkness spreads out. And it's not just the absence of light, right? It's not lack. It's not the absence of light, but it is a thing with being of its own. This is the unlight of Ungoliant. This is the cloud of Ungoliant. This is what distinguishes this darkness from other forms of darkness and shadow. And we see even here Manwë's ability, the limit, I suppose, of Manwë's ability, right? You'll remember that when Varda and Manwë are together atop Taniquetil, that Varda can hear better than any other creature upon the face of Middle-earth, and that Manwë can see better and further than any other creature upon the face of Middle-earth. So he can peer down at the darkness now, the darkness of Valinor, now that it is no longer illuminated by the light of Telperion and Laurelin, and he can see through the darkness. The darkness, the natural darkness, is no cloak against his vision. So when he sees something that is actually dark and moving northward at great pace, he knows that that is Melkor. He can kind of infer his existence, his presence there by the absence of sight. But Melkor isn't done. We're going to give chase as we race north. Then the pursuit was begun, and the earth shook beneath the horses of the host of Orome, and the fire that was stricken from the hooves of Nahar was the first light that returned to Valinor. But so soon as any came up with the cloud of Ungoliant, the riders of the Valar were blinded and dismayed, and they were scattered, and went they knew not whither, and the sound of the Valarama faltered and failed. And Tulkas was at one caught in a black net at night, and he stood powerless and beat the air in vain. But when the darkness had passed, it was too late. Melkor had gone whither he would, and his vengeance was achieved. So, again, right, we're setting out, and who is setting out? Well, of course, Orome and Tulkas are setting out. That's kind of what they are for, but also the host of Orome, also his Maiar, we can imagine. I don't imagine that any elves are counted among the host of Orome at this point. I'm more inclined to believe that these are the many Maiar pledged to Orome's domain here. But he takes to his horse, he rides out. We get the sounding of the Valarama, right? That's Orome's great horn that he blows as a challenge while riding, usually across Middle-earth in pursuit of Melkor's monsters, but now in pursuit of Melkor himself. But it doesn't matter because the cloud of Ungoliant is too much. It is too thick. No one can penetrate it. Even Tulkas, right? Tulkas was as one caught in a black net at night, and he stood powerless and beat the air in vain. The darkness eventually fades, but it's too late. Melkor has, moved on to other things, and the tragedies have only just begun. We must, of course, observe here the tragedy that is the darkening of Valinor. We have to put this in its proper context, its proper historical position, as we strive to understand the place of the Valar upon Middle-earth. And many people, while reading this book, will put some blame at the feet of the Valar here, and claim that the Valar have been indolent, that the Valar have been passive, that the Valar have not been sufficiently aggressive in their pursuit of Melkor, or in their care for Middle-earth, their care for the children of Iluvatar. And it's hard. The thing that we must remember is that the casting down of the lamps was an apocalyptic event. Right? Fire flows forth that literally changes and reforms the face of Arda itself. It is because there were no elves present for it. We don't get anything remotely like an elvish perspective on the breaking of the lamps and the absolute catastrophe that follows thereafter. But we're getting an elvish perspective, to a certain extent, we're getting an elvish perspective on the darkening of Valinor. Elves witnessed this event, and so it has passed into their history more directly, much less metaphorically, like the darkening of the lamps in the first place. So the Valar suffer the loss of their lamps. They suffer the loss of their first great home, right? Their first great abode in the middle of Middle-earth. And they flee, yes, certainly, but also withdraw. It is a tactical retreat. They cannot fight Melkor in Middle-earth because of the destruction that it would cause, the damage that it would cause to the children of Iluvatar. They don't know where the children are yet. The children have not yet awoken. So they retreat to Aman, and they erect the Pelori as a barrier. This is why the light of Telperion and Laurelin doesn't flow out across the surface of the earth, right? The earth at this point is flat. If they had if Yavanna, instead of raising the Mound of Azelahar, had gone to the top of Taniquetil and had planted there the trees, and their light had flown out across the entire world, then everything would have been different. Firstly, the light would have reached Middle-earth. There would have been shadows, I'm sure, right? But the light would have reached Middle-earth, but also the trees would have been visible to Melkor. The reason that they are on Azelahar, the reason that they are protected by the Pelori, is that they are vulnerable. But the Valar are constructing the civilization in shelter. They are, I don't know, it is it is a long retreat, right? To borrow a Tolkienian term, right? It is a long retreat. They are a long defeat, excuse me, I should say. But they are at least protecting the trees, right? This creation of Yavanna, which is a sacred thing. It is hallowed, right? It is an important thing. And there is a degree to which the invitation to the children of Iluvatar to come to Valinor is about, yes, come and live in the Blessed Realm where everything is awesome, but also you are safe here. Except, of course, not so much. We're going to see the consequences of this right now. In fact, as we move into Chapter 9, and a slide that I have entitled in memory of Star Trek The Next Generation, is Elahar, When the Trees Fell. After a time, a great concourse gathered around the Ring of Doom, and the Valar sat in shadow, for it was night. But the stars of Varda now glimmered overhead, and the air was clear, for the winds of Manwë had driven away the vapors of death, and rolled back the shadows of the sea. Then Yavanna arose and stood upon his Elahar, the green mound, but it was bare now, and black. And she laid her hands upon the trees, but they were dead and dark, and each branch that she touched broke and fell lifeless at her feet. Then many voices were lifted in lamentation, and it seemed to those that mourned that they had drained to the dregs the cup of woe that Melkor had filled for them. But it was not so. Yavanna spoke before the Valar, saying, "The light of the trees has passed away, and lives now only in the Silmarils of Fëanor. Foresighted was he. Even for those who are mightiest under Iluvatar, there is some work that they may only accomplish once and once only. The light of the trees I brought into being, and within Ea I can do so never again. Yet had I but a little of that light, I could recall life to the trees ere their roots decay, and then our hurt should be healed, and the malice of Melkor be confounded." So, here. Oh, glad Rebecca's calling out in the chat here. There's something I can't recall at the moment about an up high place where you could see or hear everything, at least when you wore the ring. I'm on hand, yes. At Parth Gallen, this is where the fellowship is separated. The Tower of Hearing and the Tower of Seeing. Yeah, this is one of the things. You know, we talked a little last week about Tolkien creating rhymes within his internal structure, that elements would recur in a diminuted state, right? They would echo again, but that echo would be less than the original sound, the original music, of course. All of this folding back in with that originating metaphor here in the pages of the Silmarillion. And certainly, I'm on hand at Parth Gallen, where, yes, you're right, this is where Boromir betrays Frodo. He races to the top, and he puts on the ring and can see everything. That is partly a consequence of the power of Amon-Hen itself before the splitting of the Fellowship. So, yes, you're remembering exactly right. That's where that happens. And it is, I think, a conscious reflection of Manwë and Varda upon Taniquetil, right? Again, all these structures, they rhyme and they replicate as we move through the story of Middle-earth as a whole. So I'm going to call this slide back up, and one of my favorite metaphors in all of Tolkien is in this reading. Then many voices were lifted in lamentation, and it seemed to those that mourned that they had drained to the dregs the cup of woe that Melkor had filled for them, but it was not so. Another one of those brilliant Tolkien terminal phrases, right? these terminal sentence fragments, but it was not so. It seems as though Melkor has poured for them this measure of sorrow and grief, and now they have consumed it all the way, as Yavanna, the gardener of Middle-earth, is standing upon his Elahar, the mound that she raised, and is touching physically the trees, Telperion and Laurelin, these black husks that were the beauty of the Blessed Realm. As she is touching them, they are cracking and breaking and falling to her feet. And everyone is crying out in lamentation at this moment. And this isn't even as bad as it gets. But Yavanna has her moment here because, well, this is possibly a nod to what we discussed in last week's reading, right? One of the reasons that Fëanor makes the Silmarils, or one of the reasons that the narrative, let's be very careful in our positioning here, one of the reasons that the narrative speculates that Fëanor may have made the Silmarils is that he possibly had some foresight, some foreshadowing of the doom that would befall Telperion and Laurelin. And here Yavanna clearly wonders the same thing, right? The light of the trees has passed away and lives now only in the Silmarils of Fëanor. Foresighted was he. Even for those who are mightiest under Iluvatar, there was some work that they may accomplish once and once only. So we've talked about this a little bit too. And this is going to be peculiarly relevant as we move through, right? Fëanor is going to claim something very similar. We're going to see proof of this in Melkor, whose power is now so diminished that he cannot, for example, change his shape anymore. He is going to be, as a consequence of the darkening of Valinor, locked in the form of the Dark Lord of Autumno, right? This armored figure. We're going to see that play out in the slides to come. And we saw it before, of course, too, because we couldn't remake the lamps. We undertook that task, we undertook that act of creation, and now it cannot be replicated. And we've reached the point in the fiction, I think, where we can now say with some certainty although with at least one or two asterisks, that acts of creation do consume something from within the creator, from within the artist. When you make a thing, you are diminished in the making of that thing to some degree, and sometimes by some special quality, right? It's not even a magnitude of creativity that flows from you. It can be a specific type of creativity. Can Yavanna do amazing things in the future? Yes, Yavanna can do amazing things in the future. Are those things the rival to the trees? Well, no, but they're not of, a clearly different order. They're still fantastic things. They're still huge undertakings. It's tempting to read this as a spilling forth of life. And I think that that's fair. Right? Let's bracket all of this first and say, I think that that is fair. Perhaps the reason that Iluvatar refers to the flame imperishable at the beginning, right? Perhaps the thing which distinguishes the flame imperishable is its imperishability. Because that is the flame that won't go out. And by extension, all other flames, all other spirits, all other fires of creativity will be diminished and will eventually go out. That's possible, right? We can think of Midiel Sindire, right? We can think of Fëanor's mom pouring so much energy, so much fire into Fëanor that she is left with not enough to maintain her own will to live. It's possible, certainly. But there's also possibly something about the uniquity of these creations that, and this is an unfinished thought. I'm not completely certain that I've got this all the way figured out. And rather than fumble toward it now, let's put a pin in it and we'll move forward. I think that there may be something to do with these singular creations being beyond the powers of replication because they are themselves unique and intentionally unique within the frame of Middle-earth. It's a little harder when we're talking about there being 3 Silmarils. It's a little harder when we're talking about there being 7 dwarven forefathers, right? But these individual acts of creation do seem to be somewhat locked. And of course, 2 trees, 2 lamps, right? In fact, we rarely create one thing at a time. So we'll maybe circle back to that as we move forward here. All the same, Yavanna has this moment of realization, right? I cannot remake the light of the trees. The light of the trees are brought into being, and within Ea, I can do so never again. Yet, had I but a little of that light, I could recall life to these trees ere their roots decay, and then our hurt should be healed and the malice of Melkor be confounded. If we just take the light of the Silmarils that Fëanor has made, hey, guess what we can do? We can now rebuild. Melkor did nothing. He showed up. He brought his buddy, and he did nothing because the trees are going to be just fine. And Fëanor is silent, but we do get perspectives from Manwë, Tulkas, and Aule. Then Manwë spoke and said, "Hearest thou, Fëanor, son of Finwë, the words of Yavanna? Wilt thou grant what she would ask?" There was a long silence, but Fëanor answered no word. Then Tulkas cried, "Speak, O Nodo, yea or nay, but who shall deny Yavanna? And did not the light of the Silmarils come from her work in the beginning?" But Aule the Maker said, "Be not hasty. We ask a greater thing than thou knowest. Let him have peace yet, a while." So, firstly, sad news, Silmarillion heirs. This is the last thing that Tulkas does in this book. We're going to mention him again once more later in this chapter, and that's it. That's a series wrap for Tulkas the Strong, whose anger passes like a mighty wind, scattering cloud and darkness before it. Unfortunately, he's going to drop out of the narrative at this point. And in fact, many of the Valar are going to drop out of the narrative within the next couple of pages. Not quite so swift. The next couple of chapters. We're really at this point. The darkening of Valinor is the event, more so than any other, which pivots our narrative focus from the Valar to the elves. It's just happening now. It's already beginning. We're declining, and the shift is going to occur really within this chapter, but absolutely, within the next couple of chapters. So it's sad that Tulkas is done. I myself have, as I've said before, really loved I feel like properly discovering Tulkas as we've moved through this reading of the Silmarillion. I think he's just delighted me every single time he's shown up. And that's it. But to the substance of the piece, right? We have these 3 voices here. We have the rulership of Manwë. "Hearest thou, Fëanor, son of Finwë, the words of Yavanna? Wilt thou grant what she would ask?" So there is silence for a moment, and Manwë intervenes only to clarify and to demand an answer, right? "Hearest thou, Fëanor, son of Finwë, the words of Yavanna? Wilt thou grant what she would ask?" And another long silence, so Tulkas steps in. "Speak, O Nodo, yea or nay, but who shall deny Yavanna? And did not the light of the Silmarils come from her work in the beginning?" A completely valid point. Two completely valid points, right? He's urging Fëanor to speak, to make the decision, but he's absolutely putting his thumb on the scale there, right? Who shall deny Yavanna? Firstly, it's Yavanna. What are you doing? Secondly, didn't the light of the Silmarils come from her light in the first place? If she had not made the trees, you would have nothing. Or you would have pretty prisms, right? You'd have these adamantine crystalline bodies, but no soul within them. The thing that makes the Silmarils is the light of the trees. That's the embodying essence. That's the Fëa of the Silmarils, the spirit there. And then we get the response from Aule. And some people will read this response from Aule and position him in Fëanor's corner. And I don't think that that's... Well, it's impossible, of course, to completely repudiate that, but I don't think that that's where this is coming from, because we've already seen Aule go through his own kind of similar experience with the Dwarven forefathers, and partly what we get there is an embodiment of good creativity, as we said at the time, right? We are positioning in the chapter of Aule and Yavanna, we are positioning Aule as the good Melkor. He wants to create, he is impatient, yes, but when challenged, he submits. He submits to Iluvatar and he steps back. And partly that is because he doesn't want things to control. He doesn't want things to possess. He wants things to love and to teach. That's why he creates the dwarves in the first place. So already, Fëanor's love of the Silmarils is very different than Aule's love of the things that he himself has created. Whether it's the surface of Arda, or it's the dwarves, or it's the many gems that he himself has cast. Yeah, Aule is wise, says Gladrebecki. Absolutely, he's been through the fire. He's been tested. I think that what we see here is him saying, this is not easy. Not the answer is going to be no. Be not hasty. We ask a greater thing than thou knowest. Let him have peace yet a while. He's saying to Tulkas, don't force his hand. Don't make Fëanor answer now, because if you answer in haste and your wisdom is insufficient, we might regret what flows forth from this moment. And of course, bad things flow forth from this moment. But Fëanor spoke then and cried bitterly, for the less even as for the greater there is some deed that may accomplish but once only, and in that deed his heart shall rest. It may be that I can unlock my jewels, but never again shall I make their like, and if I must break them, I shall break my heart, and I shall be slain, first of all the Eldar and Aman. Not the first, said Mandos, but they did not understand his word. And again there was silence, while Fëanor brooded in the dark. It seemed to him that he was beset in a ring of enemies, and the words of Melkor returned to him, saying that the Silmarils were not safe if the Valar should possess them. And is he not Valar as are they, said his thought, and does he not understand their hearts? Yea, a thief shall reveal thieves. Then he cried aloud, this thing I will not do of free will, but if the Valar will constrain me, then shall I know indeed that Melkor is of their kindred. Then Mandos said, thou hast spoken. And Nianna arose, and went up onto Zelahar, and cast back her grey hood, and with her tears washed away the defilements of Ungoliant. And she sang in mourning for the bitterness of the world and the marring of Arda. So I think we see here exactly what Aule is warning against, right? Don't push Fëanor at this moment. Give him a minute, because he responds with heat. He responds immediately. He cries bitterly, for the less, even as for the greater, there is some deed that he may accomplish, but once only. Okay, Yavanna, I know where you're coming from. You can't remake the trees. I cannot remake the Silmarils. My heart is in them. If I must break them, I shall break my heart and shall be slain first of all the Eldar in Aman. And of course, Mandos here has his knowledge, right? Not prophecy exactly, because this has already happened. We just don't know about it. The first elf to be slain in cold blood in Aman, that has already happened. We'll talk about that in, I think, even just the next slide, right? You would think that when Mandos says one of these cryptic things, that every single person in the room would turn to him and say, okay, you need to explain everything that you just said right then. This is not poetry. You need to tell us what is going on. But no, not the first, said Mandos. And of course, we're distinguishing this here too from the fate of Miriel Serinde, Fëanor's mother, who did not die, right? Who was not slain, but who lacked sufficient will to live. Something has changed. With the crafting of weapons at Melkor's urging, we have brought violence into Valinor, right? The Blessed Realm has been marred once more now by the potential of violence. First the forging of the sword, then the unsheathing of the sword and the placing at Fingolfin's chest by Fëanor, and now the use of weapon and bloodshed here in the Blessed Realm. And we're getting, of course, all of the lies and the gossip and the insinuation of Melkor now doing exactly what Melkor planned for it to do. Again, we will recall that moment when Fëanor always claims, no, I never listen to a word Melkor says because nobody hates Melkor more than me. And no one has ever been more under the sway of Melkor than Fëanor is in this moment. Is he not Valar, as are they? Does he not understand their hearts? Yea, a thief shall reveal thieves. And then he throws it back at the Valar themselves. This thing I will not do of free will. First up, I'm not going to choose to do this. I'm not going to choose to unlock my Silmarils and to release their light back to Yavanna so that she can heal the trees. I'm not going to. I know that you can make me, and you know that you can make me, but if you do, then I will know that Melkor is absolutely one of you. And you'll remember, one of the first things that happens when we enter into Arda is that Melkor is no longer counted one of the Valar. He is technically one of the Valar because he's an Ainur. He's one of the Ainur. He is an Ainu who comes into Arda, but he is expelled from their company. He is exiled, in effect, from their company. But if they force him, if they make Fëanor break the Silmarils, or if they break the Silmarils themselves, then he will know indeed that Melkor is of their kindred, and Mando says, thou hast spoken. Because they accept his decision, even though it's a selfish decision, even though it's a dangerous decision, even though it is a decision rooted in jealousy and in dark desire for the things of his own making, right? For the things of his own hand. They respect it because in this moment they prove definitively that the elves of Valinor, the Calaquendi, are never thralls. They are never slaves. They are never servants to the Valar. That is not what the relationship is. Even as Fëanor is so fearful, even as he is about to raise the Noldor in rebellion, an outright rebellion, they are proving that that's not the relationship. That's not, that everything that he suspects is just not true. So, Fëanor has made his choice, and we get news from Formenos. Oh, I didn't even talk about Nienna Morning. You know what? I'm going to take the rare but not unprecedented step of going backwards in this slide because I want to talk about Nienna arising and going up to Azalahar and casting back her grey hood and with her tears washing away the defilements of Ungoliant. And she sang in mourning for the bitterness of the world and the marring of Arda. Of course, symmetry here, right? This is not the first time that Nienna has wept upon Azalahar because she watered the ground. She watered the mold with her tears when the trees were first planted, when Yavanna first creates them. She weeps then. And now we might wonder, was she weeping for the trees that would live, the trees that would die? Was she weeping for the darkness that would come? I mean, we don't know, unfortunately. We don't have enough of Nienna's perspective. And the elves, of course, would not have enough of Nienna's perspective. But still, she weeps. And in so doing, we can see the beginning of, well, it's a treacherous thing to talk about the beginning of healing, right? It's a treacherous thing, particularly this close, particularly this urgently. But there is at least a cleansing. There is at least a passing of something in this moment. Okay, let's get on to all the news that's fit to print from Formenos. But even as Nienna mourned, there came messengers from Formenos, and they were Noldor and bore new tidings of evil. For they told how a blind darkness came northward, and in the midst walked some power for which there was no name, and the darkness issued from it. But Melkor also was there, and he came to the house of Fëanor, and there he slew Finwë, king of the Noldor, before his doors, and spilled the first blood in the blessed realm. For Finwë alone had not fled from the horror of the dark. And they were told that Melkor had broken the stronghold of Formenos, and taken all the jewels of the Noldor that were hoarded in that place, and the Silmarils were gone. Then Fëanor rose, and lifting up his hand before Manwë, he cursed Melkor, naming him Morgoth, the black foe of the world. And by that name only was he known to the Eldar ever after. And he cursed also the summons of Manwë, and the hour in which he came to Taniquetil, thinking in the madness of his rage and grief that that if he had been at Formenos, his strength would have availed more than to be slain also, as Melkor had purposed. Then Fëanor ran from the Ring of Doom and fled into the night, for his father was dearer to him than the light of Valinor or the peerless works of his hands. And who among sons of elves or of man have held their fathers of greater worth? Many there grieved for the anguish of Fëanor, but his loss was not his alone. And Yavanna wept by the mound, in fear that the darkness should swallow the last rays of the light of Valinor forever. For though the Valar did not yet understand fully what had befallen, they perceived that Melkor had called upon some aid that came from beyond Arda. The Silmarils had passed away, and all one it may seem whether Fëanor had said yea or nay to Yavanna, yet had he said yea at the first before the tidings came from Formenos, it may be that after his deeds would have been other than they were. But now the doom of the Noldor drew near. So, Melkor and Ungoliant flee from Valinor. They head north. They go straight to Formenos, of course, and presumably Melkor is thinking that Morgoth, dark foe, black foe of the world. Morgoth assumes that he's going to go to Formenos, that he is going to kill Fëanor, who so recently slammed the door in his face, and then take the Silmarils. As it turns out, Fëanor is not there. Fëanor has been summoned back to Taniquetil by Manwë, but Finwë is there, king of the Noldor and Fëanor's father. And this is the death. This is what Mandos is referring to in that previous slide, right? Not the first, says Mandos ominously, and no one questions him on what exactly he's talking about. Well, he's talking about Finwë. Finwë alone had not fled from the horrors of the dark, but Melkor breaks into Formenos. He takes all the jewels of the Noldor that they had squirreled away up there, but much more importantly, he takes the Silmarils. Then Fëanor rose, and lifting up his hand before Manwë, he cursed Melkor, naming him Morgoth, the black foe of the world, and by that name only was he known to the Eldar ever after. Then he also curses Manwë and the summons and the hour in which he came to Taniquetil, thinking in the madness of his rage and grief that had he been at Formenos, his strength would have availed more than to be slain also, as Melkor had purposed. By implication, no it wouldn't. By implication, of course, he would also have been killed by Melkor, by Morgoth. Then Fëanor ran from the Ring of Doom and fled into the night. And here we get a really interesting rhetorical pivot. This is dissimilar to basically everything else that we get in this chapter, and really most else of what we get in the Silmarillion. I can't think of many moments where the narrative offers us a particular moral take on what is happening, right? When we're faced with a moral challenge, we either get a direct account of the emotions experienced by that character, or we get some framing of that account from a greater distance. But this is argumentation. This is a rhetorical move designed to get you onto Fëanor's side, and this is another moment when we have to think about the documentary history of the text that we are reading, right? For his father was dearer to him than the light of Valinor or the peerless works of his hands, and who among sons of elves or of men have held their fathers of greater worth? Citation needed. Citation very much needed on that. Actually, is he really thinking about his father? We are going to see in the pages to come that revenge on Morgoth for the death of Finwë is not, in fact, going to be Fëanor's primary occupation. You know, in fact, who among elves or men have held their fathers of greater worth? Fingolfin. Fingolfin absolutely has, and we're going to see that play out in the pages to come, too. But here we're situating Fëanor as a kind of folk hero. And the thing is, this works. This works on some readers. You can go out there on the wilds of the internet. You can go to Reddit pages that are 400 comments long, and you can find people arguing that Fëanor is a good dude, that it is his love of Finwë that leads to this, well, that leads to the action that we're about to see, the absolute tragedy that we're about to see. But I take this passage to be, what? Less ingenuous than that, right? More disingenuous than that. More ironic, perhaps, than that. And we're getting now, as we're descending in our oratorical hierarchy here, right? As the narrative register of the Silmarillion is getting closer and closer to the ground, right? We start in the halls before time. We start with Iluvatar. We start with the Ainur. We come down with the Valar into an unformed Arda, into an unformed Ea, and we do all of creation. And then we're talking about the Valar and Melkor and their clashes and the reshaping of the world. And then we get the awakening of the children, and that kind of situates us closer to the ground. But of course, then we have the diaspora west. We have the travel to Valinor. But now we're in a realm of real characters, I suppose, right? We have like real and complex psychology here for almost the first time in the book. It's been rising, of course, as we've been progressing, but Fëanor feels like a real character, and this feels like it's creating a kind of explicit textual irony, that we are being reminded of the frame. This is almost an alienation device, right? This is a distancing device. This is a thing that we are intended to read and question, because we are going to read the account of what Fëanor does next. And maybe the intent of the text is to make us, or the intent of Tolkien as the originating author of this text, right? And his careful positioning of this almost propagandistic moment in the narrative is to make us question what comes next, and to question what is right and who is right as we move forward. Yeah, as Galadriel says, strangely didn't die if his father was more dear to him than the Silmarils. Yes, exactly, right? He demonstrates, it's an old axiom, but it is one that is very well worth remembering. People show you who they are. People show you all the time who they are. Let's keep going here. Yeah, so we have this moment too, right? That Fëanor races out into the night. He departs, but his loss was not his alone. Yavanna wept by the mound in fear that the darkness would swallow the last rays of the light of Valinor forever. For though the Valar did not yet understand fully what had befallen, they perceived that Melkor had called from some aid that came from beyond Arda. Again, right? We were mentioning last week this desire in some readers, me included, to read Ungoliant as some kind of cosmic horror, some kind of other category of being. Again, technically, something from beyond Arda. One of the Maiar, right? Ungoliant is a Maya that came to Earth, that came to Arda in that moment of creation. Is not of Arda, but is of outside of Arda, right? As opposed to, orcs or some kind of animal that is actually native to this world. No, that this is a different category of being. The Silmarils had passed away, and all one it may seem whether Fëanor had said yea or nay to Yavanna. So the Silmarils are gone. They have been taken. And maybe in this moment, you don't care so much about whether Fëanor had said yep or he had said nope. Whether Fëanor had agreed to break the Silmarils before learning of their theft or had already defied the will of Yavanna at this point. Yet had he said yea at the first, before the tidings came from Formanus, it may be that his afterdeeds would have been other than they were. But now the doom of the Noldor drew near. It's important that before he knew the Silmarils were lost, he had already denied them, to the Valar, and denied the healing of the trees of Valinor. Let's keep pressing on. Switch back, in fact, to Morgoth, and I mentioned last week that there are some moments in the Silmarillion that are just metal, that are just hardcore, that are just the most serious of serious business. And we are about to get a serious contender for the most metal moment in all of the Silmarillion. But we're going to set the stage here with Morgoth escaping from the Valar. Meanwhile, Morgoth, escaping from the pursuit of the Valar, came to the wastes of Araman. This land lay northward between the mountains of the Pelori and the Great Sea, as Avathar lay to the south. But Araman was a wider land, and between the shores and the mountains were barren plains, even colder as the ice drew nearer. Through this region Morgoth and Ungoliant passed in haste, and so came through the great mists of Oriomore to the Helcaraxe, where the strait between Araman and Middle-earth was filled with grinding ice. And he crossed over, and came back at last to the north of the outer lands. Together they went on, for Morgoth could not elude Ungoliant, and her cloud was still about him, and all her eyes were upon him, and they came to those lands that lay north of the Firth of Drengist. Now Morgoth was drawing close to the ruins of Angband, where his great western stronghold had been, and Ungoliant perceived his hope, and knew that here he would seek to escape from her, and she stayed him, demanding that he fulfill his promise. "Blackheart," she said, "I have done thy bidding, but I hunger still." So, a little geography lesson here as we race north from Valinor. We see the mirror of Avathar, right? As Avathar is the land between the mountain and the sea in the very southern tip of the crescent-shaped continent of Aman. So Araman is the land between the mountain and the sea in the northern wastes of Aman, but it is wider. It is frozen, particularly as the ice approaches, as we note here, and we approach the grinding ice, right? We come through the great mists of Oriomore, the ever mist, right? Oiolase, another name for Taniquetal, means ever white or ever snow. Similarly, Oiomore means ever mist, like the constant mist here. And then we get to the Helcaraxe, which I've said before is one of my favorite words in all of Tolkien's constructed languages, the grinding ice, right? This narrow strait between Aman and Middle-earth. As we get to the outer lands here, that is another name for Middle-earth, also known as the Hitherlands. He refers to those two as we move through the development more than the execution of the Silmarillion. But all of those names relate to Middle-earth. And then he's coming south, right? He's approaching Angband. He's approaching that Angband, literally prison of iron, or even hell of iron, it's sometimes known as. This is the western stronghold that Melkor creates when he himself resides in Utumno, his fortress in Utumno. He gives Angband to Sauron. It is also similarly destroyed when the Valar ride out to war. But Ungoliant understands what he's doing, that he's getting close to his home turf. He's going to have that home field advantage, so she stops him, she stays him, and demands that he fulfill the promise that he made. And we'll remember here, that promise was, "I will give you what you want, yea, with both hands," as he smirks his way to persuading Ungoliant in last week's reading. What wouldst thou have more?" said Morgoth. "Dost thou desire all the world for thy belly? I did not vow to give thee that. I am its lord." Not so much, said Ungoliant, but thou hast a great treasure from Formenos. I will have all that, yea, with both hands thou shalt give it. Then perforce Morgoth surrendered to her the gems that he bore with him, one by one and grudgingly, and she devoured them, and their beauty perished from the world. Huger and darker yet grew Ungoliant, but her lust was unsated. With one hand thou givest, she said, with the left only. Open thy right hand. In his right hand Morgoth held close the Silmarils, and though they were locked in a crystal casket, they had begun to burn him, and his hand was clenched in pain, and he would not open it. Nay, he said, thou hast had thy due. For with my power that I put into thee, thy work was accomplished. I need thee no more. These things thou shalt not have nor see. I name them unto myself forever. Acknowledging here that Melkor has poured his power into Ungoliant in order that Ungoliant escape Avatar, firstly, right? You'll remember that in the version that we just read at the beginning of today's session, the Morgoth's Ring version, the second phase version of the story, she is trapped there. She lacks the power to leave. Having retreated into darkness, there is not enough light for her to sustain an escape attempt, and Morgoth comes to her and gives her the crystals, gives her the green gemstones in that version of the story that he holds aloft. And we're not sure of the mechanism exactly. We're not exactly sure of how he gives her power in the published Silmarillion version of that story, but here he acknowledges that he has. For with my power that I put into thee, thy work was accomplished. I have forced some sense of my power, my fire into you so that you could do everything that we just did, right? He's refusing to give her complete, untrammeled credit here. So he gives her the gems one by one and grudgingly, and she devours them and her beauty perishes from the world. And we did talk a little about this last week. But this is the fundamental difference of Ungoliant. This is the thing that, or one of the things that distinguishes Ungoliant from every other category of creature that we see in the Silmarillion, in the Legendarium, in fact. Because the one characteristic that we see commonly associated with evil creatures in Tolkien's writing is this greed, right? It is avarice. It is dragon sickness. It is all of the things, all the various manifestations that we see of that desire for wealth and dominion. They want to rule the world, not have any other relationship with it, right? But Ungoliant does want a different relationship with it. She wants to consume it. And that is a different kind of desire. It's a different kind of destructive quality, because in the end, Melkor doesn't want the world destroyed. He wants the world to be his. Sauron doesn't want the world destroyed. He wants the world to be his. They will destroy in the pursuit of that goal, of course, but ultimately it is a goal of possession, not of destruction. But Ungoliant is fundamentally, specifically different in that regard. And we'll call that out in just a moment, in fact, as we reflect on the good nature, the good fortune that we have, that it is Morgoth that holds the Silmarils and not Ungoliant. But Ungoliant had grown great, and he less by the power that had gone out of him, and she rose against him, and her cloud closed about him, and she enmeshed him in a web of clinging thongs to strangle him. Then Morgoth sent forth a terrible cry that echoed in the mountains. Therefore that region was called Lamoth, for the echoes of his voice dwelt there ever after, so that any who cried aloud in that land awoke them, and all the waste between the hills and the sea was filled with a clamour as of voices in anguish. The cry of Morgoth in that hour was the greatest and most dreadful that was ever heard in the northern world. The mountains shook, and the earth trembled, and the rocks were riven asunder. Deep in the forgotten places that cry was heard, far beneath the ruined halls of Angband, in vaults which the Valar in the haste of their assault had not descended, Balrogs lurked still, awaiting ever the return of their lord. And now swiftly they arose, and passing over Hithlum they came to Lamoth as a tempest of fire. With their whips of flame they smote asunder the webs of Ungoliant, and she quailed and turned to flight, belching black vapours to cover her, and fleeing from the north she went down into Beleriand, and dwelt beneath Ered Gorgoroth in that dark valley that was after named Nan Durgothab, the Valley of Dreadful Death, because of the horror that she bred there. For other foul creatures of spider form had dwelt there since the days of the delving of Angband, and she mated with them and devoured them. And even after Ungoliant herself departed and went whither she would into the forgotten south of the world, her offspring abode there and wove their hideous webs. Of the fate of Ungoliant no tale tells, yet some have said that she ended long ago, when in her uttermost famine she devoured herself at last. Galadriel Becky's calling out in the chat here that it's like the mythical explanation of echoes. Yes, it is like an etiological myth, right? We can hear the echo in this place because the echo of Morgoth's voice still resounds there. It's if you've ever been in a mountainous environment, even out of doors in a mountainous environment, but certainly if you're in a constrained environment, in chasms and canyons, in caves, then the echoes can play incredible tricks on your hearing. They can sound otherworldly for sure. They can sound very naturalistic in weird ways too. Echoes are, I think that, certainly the Greeks have their myth of echo. That's where we get the name from, in fact. The Romans have their myth of echo. I would be confident. I don't know off the top of my head a Norse myth, an etiological myth for the creation of echoes, but I'm sure there is one. I would imagine that most, if not all, cultures have their variation of the myth. And here we get something like our version too, right? And when I was talking about the most metal thing that happens in the Silmarillion, this I do think is a serious contender. A crashing, a legion of Balrogs emerging from beneath the ruined fortress, the subterranean fortress of Angband, and still they are beneath it in dark places where the Valar in their haste did not descend, right? This legion of Balrogs rushing to the surface at the sound of Morgoth's cry, lashing at Ungoliant with their whips of flame and driving her down into Beleriand, across the Ered Gorgoroth there, the Mountains of Terror. Just a really great name, honestly, into Nan Durgatha, which we get translated for us, the Valley of the Dreadful Death. And this is, as we've had our series wrap for Tulkas, this is a wrap on Ungoliant. We don't know what happens to her. We know that at some point she spawns Shelob, who appears, of course, in the pages of The Lord of the Rings. But this is it for her. And this idea of... there's almost like a moral myth quality here too, right? Driven down again into darkness, she mates with and devours the other spider creatures of Dungortheb, the Valley of Dreadful Death. She mates with them and consumes them, and then ultimately is forced to consume herself because she will not venture back into the light which she craves and despises. There's a poetic ending there, I think. But a very powerful moment, and now we have, in a sense, the second rise of Morgoth, right? Now, and you'll note that the positioning of the text here, because this is an elven text, because we are reading these stories that have been passed down from elf to elf, we have now transitioned in the narrative voice. We're not going to talk about Melkor anymore. We're going to talk about Morgoth and the function of this book. So the Balrogs come, they rescue Morgoth, and they carry him down into the earth. Let's wrap this part up. In fact, yes. So now we're going to acknowledge the silver lining, the very brief silver lining. And thus the fear of Yavanna that the Silmarils would be swallowed up and fall into nothingness did not come to pass. But they remained in the power of Morgoth. And he, being freed, gathered again all his servants that he could find and came to the ruins of Angband. There he delved anew his vast vaults and dungeons, and above their gates he reared the threefold peaks of Thangorodrim, and a great reek of dark smoke was ever wreathed about them. There countless became the hosts of his beasts and his demons, and the race of the orcs, bred long before, grew and multiplied in the bowels of the earth. Dark now fell the shadow on Beleriand, as is told thereafter. But in Angband, Morgoth forged for himself a great crown of iron, and he called himself King of the World. In token of this, he set the Silmarils in his crown. His hands were burned black by the touch of those hallowed jewels, and black they remained ever after, nor was he ever free from the pain of the burning and the anger of the pain. That crown he never took from his head, though its weight became a deadly weariness. Never but once only did he depart for a while secretly from his domain in the north. Seldom indeed did he leave the deep places of his fortress, but governed his armies from his northern throne. And once only did he himself wield weapon while his realm lasted. For now, more than in the days of Autumno, ere his pride was humbled, his hatred devoured him. And in the domination of his servants and the inspiring of them with lust of evil, he spent his spirit. Nonetheless, his majesty as one of the Valar long remained, though turned to terror, and before his face all save the mightiest sank into a dark pit of fear. So now we see the real kind of... I hesitate to say last, but no, I think that's fair. I think the last great transition in Morgoth, in his characterization, in his narrative function, yes, but also in his place in the world. Now, though he has had his victory, right? Though he has vanquished the trees, he's vanquished the light of Valinor. He knows that that has happened. He knows that that is true. but still he is consumed by this ever greater hatred, right? More than in the days of Autumno, ere his pride was humbled. He has been taken to Valinor in chains. He has been kept there for Vailian ages. He was forced then to live among the Valar, among the Noldor. It took a long time for his secret schemes and plans to create those rifts between the different societies, the different communities in Valinor. Now he's had his victory. Yes, he's got what he wanted. He's got the Silmarils, he's destroyed the trees, he's back in Middle-earth, he's no longer a prisoner of the Valar, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because there is this pain. There is this deadly weariness. There is the anger of the pain. He has lost so much in the pursuit of this goal that he is now a fragment of what he was. Though even here at the end we're reminded, nonetheless, his majesty as one of the Valar long remained, though turned to terror, and before his face all save the mightiest sank into the dark pit of fear. So yes, he is diminished. He is much, much less than he was, but he's still the mightiest of the Valar in origin. He's still the strongest that there ever was. So even now, he's a force to be reckoned. It's so astonishing to see here the laying out of this kind of path of evil, I think, as we move forward. I should note here, too, the Thangorodrim, the Mountains of Tyranny here. Just so good, right? The Ered Gorgoroth, the Mountains of Terror, and the Thangorodrim, these three volcanic peaks risen above the gates of Angband here, the Mountains of Terror. And here we see, too, in the darkness, right? There countless became the hosts of his beasts and his demons, and the race of the orcs spread long before, grew and multiplied in the bowels of the earth. This is the great thing about orcs. This is why Morgoth wanted orcs in the first place. This is why he took elves and twisted them, of course. As you'll remember, that version, according to the pages of the Silmarillion, is that they breed. He doesn't need to pour more of his energy into them. They just create themselves because, in a sense, they have the same reproductive faculty as the children of Iluvatar. That's the thing of it, is that they are independent from his own power source. They have this connection directly back to Iluvatar. Do orcs have souls? This is, of course, an age-old question and not one that we are going to be able to answer, particularly in tonight's show, for sure. So, Morgoth is back in Middle-earth. He is buried deep beneath Angband. He has delved out all those vast vaults and dungeons, and he is once again in Fortress, waiting for the foe to come to him. And come the foe does, of course. Now, when it was known that Morgoth had escaped from Valinor and pursuit was unavailing, the Valar remained long seated in darkness in the Ring of Doom, and the Maiar and the Vanyar stood beside them and wept. But the Noldor, for the most part, returned to Tirion and mourned for the darkening of their fair city. Through the dim ravine of the Calcaria, fogs drifted in from the shadowy seas and mantled its towers, and the lamp of the Minden burned pale in the gloom. Then suddenly Fëanor appeared in the city and called on all to come to the high court of the king upon the summit of Tuna. But the doom of banishment had been laid upon him was not yet lifted, and he rebelled against the Valar. A great multitude gathered swiftly, therefore, to hear what he would say, and the hill and all the stairs and streets that climbed upon it were lit with the light of many torches that each bore in hand. Fëanor was a master of words, and his tongue was great power over hearts when he would use it. And that night he made a speech before the Noldor which they ever remembered. Fierce and fell were his words, and filled with anger and pride, and hearing them the Noldor were stirred to madness. His wrath and his hate were given most to Morgoth. And yet well nigh all that he said came from the very lies of Morgoth himself. But he was distraught with grief for the slaying of his father, and with anguish for the rape of the Silmarils. He claimed now the kingship of all of the Noldor, since Finwë was dead, and he scorned the decrees of the Valar. So, Glorfin David is asking the very pertinent question. So the orcs are a race now? I mean, functionally, yes. What do we mean by race, right? It's a difficult thing to try and pin down. Orcs are, if anything, less of a race than a species, right? We're kind of falling into the Western fantasy tradition, the Dungeons and Dragons fantasy tradition of using race to mean entirely different types of creature which broadly resemble one another. But actually, it's not a racial analog as much as it is a special analog, I guess. Elves and men are different, though they can, of course, as we'll see in the pages to come, they can intermarry and can have children between them. So I don't know. And Professor Tolkien is never completely definitive on this. As I've said before, he kicks around various ideas of the creation of the orcs. He himself wasn't completely happy with the idea that the orcs would have souls, therefore, right? It is, from a certain perspective, a kindness, therefore, to slay an orc, because you are liberating its Fea from its Hroa, and you are sending that Fea to wherever, presumably to the halls of Mandos, right? Presumably, orc spirits are going to go to the halls of Mandos and wait for the end of all days, just like all the other elves would, but that's unclear. So there are certain points in his development of the Legendarium where he treats the orcs like homunculi, right? That they are like golems, that they are taken from the earth, which is not dissimilar to what the movie adaptation does with the Uruk-hai of Saruman, of course, right? We're kind of separating a completely biological origin point for the orcs there and commingling it with a quasi-industrial origin point for the orcs. So he's played with that too. It's a difficult thing to completely pin down. There comes a point when you're thinking about the orcs of the Lord of the Rings that you just kind of have to decide for yourself what makes the most sense to you and treat that like it's canon, I suppose, which is, an anathema, of course, to those of us who are engaged in this kind of close reading. But really, that's kind of where we are. It's similar to the Ungoliant question, right? It's similar to this notion of is Ungoliant of the Maiar or is Ungoliant something completely different? If you want her to be something completely different, you can just kind of accept that she is and take the aesthetic promptings of the text to help you understand that. And certainly the aesthetic promptings of the text don't give us the sense that the orcs are corrupted elves, right? They don't give us the sense. There's no tragic beauty to the orcs that we might associate. Usually when we see things that have fallen in the pages of the Lord of the Rings and the pages of the Silmarillion, we get a sense of that, of the tragedy of that. We don't really, in the pages of the Lord of the Rings, get a sense of the tragedy of the orcs that we face and confront. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So it's difficult to be completely sure about this or completely comprehensive about it. But yeah, certainly I would probably follow the modern Dungeons & Dragons thinking where we start to pivot to using species or start to pivot to using, different words rather than race, which is a very loaded word, which has been kind of neutralized and naturalized over the course of the last 50 years by fantasy writing in general, right? We're absolutely accustomed to thinking of elves and dwarves and humans as being different races, but wow, you get into some really treacherous, or, not just to put the blame at the feet of fantasy writers here, also Vulcans and Klingons and Ferengi are all different races too, right? It's treacherous when you start doing that if we're trying to be responsible, for one thing, right, in the real world in which we all live and the real world which we all share, but also if we're really trying to schematize and to understand what is happening. It's very tempting when we start talking about this concept of race, this Dungeons & Dragons concept of racialization. It's really easy to fall into that trap of thinking that, elves are just humans with pointy ears and dwarves are just little humans with beards. And that is honestly sometimes very applicable. Sometimes that's completely fair. Star Trek, I'm kind of looking at you. My beloved Star Trek, I'm kind of looking at you. But there are plenty of places in which that kind of thinking blinds you to the richness of the text and blinds you to the deeper purpose of the author. I don't think that Tolkien for a second visualizes elves as being just like man, but with pointy ears and long hairs. We'll talk about elves and pointy ears at some point, I promise. Or dwarves as being just little guys with long beards. That's to take that understanding of systems of race in the works of the professor, I think is to do yourself a disservice as a reader, honestly. Like, you're not going to get the richness of the text if that's how you're approaching these questions. And I think that that's where some very thin no, I think I'll stick with thin. That's where some very thin criticism of Tolkien is derived, is from that kind of superficial reading of the text and a failure to really engage with what the professor is meaningfully presenting, right? If elves are just human beings with different kind of facial characteristics and different, aesthetic characteristics, then why do we have this vast history? Why do we have these constructed languages? Why do we have a completely different and incompatible philosophical schematic for the elves versus the man? They are different. They are not like us. That is from which their beauty chiefly derives, right? This idea of otherness. I've talked before about one of Tolkien's most reliable philosophical impulses, it seems to me, to be the love of diversity, the love of differentiation. And that is something that we see very clearly when we're reading the book carefully, but something that is sometimes missed and sometimes deliberately missed by people who want to take a more critical view of the professor and his works. Okay, let me try and catch up with where I am now. Yes. Fëanor appears in the city and he gives his big speech. Let's move on, in fact, to his big speech. Well, before we move on to his big speech specifically, let us note here, Fierce and fell were his words, and filled with anger and pride, and hearing them the Noldor were stirred to madness. His wrath and his hate were given most to Morgoth, and yet well nigh all that he said came from the very lies of Morgoth himself, right? Almost all of his rhetoric, almost all that we're about to see on the next slide, is the consequence of lies put in place, seeded by Morgoth, and then tended by, nursed by, farmed by the Noldor themselves. But the narrative does acknowledge he is distraught with grief for the slaying of his father and with anguish for the rape of the Silmarils, right? And of course, there's obviously a very loaded word in that sentence that we would not use so casually in a modern context, but this is an Anglo-Saxon word that Tolkien is deploying with a great deal of purpose here. And so Fëanor claims the kingship of all of the Noldor since Finwë is dead, and he scorns the decrees of the Valar. And this is one of those complicated moments, right? Because his father is dead, he is the eldest son, the kingship by right should be his. And the kingship of the elves is not something that's decided by the Valar. It's something that is deeper than that. It is something that is more fundamental. He has actually the right of kings, right? He is the person at the time. The only thing that's barring him from being king of the Noldor is that he's been exiled. He's been exiled by not just the Valar, but by Manwë, right? Mandos reminded us in last week's reading that Manwë is the king of Aman, yes, but also the king of all of Arda. There is no place where you can go to escape his authority, and he has exiled you, Fëanor. So Fëanor, by what right, is claiming the throne at this point? So this idea of the monarchy being destabilized, right? You'll remember so many discussions about how important and how pivotal, how load-bearing the feudalistic structures of the medieval period are in Tolkien's conception, in Tolkien's imaginary, right? He absolutely believes that this is true because, again, if you believe that kings are ordained actually by God and are themselves the king because God thinks it's a good idea for that person to be the king, then you can put your faith and your support into that system because it is inescapably just, because it is inescapably good and virtuous, right? I know that that's a huge mental leap to make at the first step there. That first hurdle is difficult for many modern people to get over, particularly modern Americans, though apparently less so now than maybe 6 months ago, but still, here we are. I think that this destabilization of Fëanor's right to rule is an important aspect of the schisms, the rifts, the internal dissonance that we're going to see in the elven populations moving forward. So let's get to Fëanor's actual trouble here. Why, O people of the Noldor, he cried, why should we longer serve the jealous Valar, who cannot keep us nor even their own realm secure from their enemy? And though he be now their foe, are not they and he of one kin? Vengeance calls me hence, and even were it otherwise, I would not dwell longer in the same land with the kin of my father's slaying and the thief of my treasure. Yet I am not the only valiant in this valiant people, and have you not all lost your king? And what else have you not lost, cooped up here in a narrow land between the mountains and the sea? Here once was light that the Valar begrudged to Middle-earth, and now dark levels all. Shall we mourn here deedless forever, a shadow folk, mist-haunting, dropping vain tears in the thankless sea? Or shall we return to our home, and Coeven and sweet ran the waters under unclouded stars, and wide lands lay about, where a free people might walk? There they lie still, and await us who in our folly forsook them. Come away, let the cowards keep this city. Long he spoke, and ever he urged the Noldor to follow him, and by their own prowess to win freedom and great realms in the lands of the east, before it was too late. For he echoed the lies of Melkor, that the Valar had cozened them, and would hold them captive so that men might rule in Middle-earth. Many of the Eldar heard then for the first time of the aftercomers. Fair shall the end be, he cried, though long and hard shall be the road. Say farewell to bondage, but say farewell also to ease. Say farewell to the weak, say farewell to your treasures. More still shall we make. Journey light, but bring with you your swords, for we will go further than Orome, endure longer than Tulkas. We will never turn back from pursuit. After Morgoth to the ends of the earth, war shall he have and hatred undying. But when we have conquered and have regained the Silmarils, then we and we alone shall be lords of the unsullied light and masters of the bliss and beauty of Arda. No other race shall oust us. He's a firecracker, that Fëanor. So we can see here the positioning of his rhetoric, right? We can see here how he is both arriving at these political conclusions, I suppose we can say, and how he is articulating them to leverage this narrative that has been constructed by the Noldor themselves, taken from Morgoth's lies, but also to motivate them into action at this point. So he begins with this very simple and straightforward. Why should we serve the jealous Valar, right? We came here, in part, because they told us that they could keep us safe. They obviously can't. Though they are now fighting one another, are they not all the same, really? Vengeance calls me hence, and even were it otherwise, I would no longer dwell in the same land with the kin of my father's slayer and the thief of my treasure. So even if I wasn't on this mission of vengeance, that is my primary purpose. I am going to kill Morgoth for killing my father. That is the primary purpose. But even if that wasn't the primary purpose, I still wouldn't want to live here with the kin of Morgoth. They are all the same, these Valar. And have you not also lost your king, my people, the Noldor, here before me? What else have you not lost, cooped here in a narrow land between the mountains and the sea? So then he pivots, right? It's not just about the Valar failing to protect them, or the Valar being kin to Morgoth, about all of these foes, these people who are not like us being all one and the same. Shall we mourn deedless forever, as shadow folk mist-haunted, right? The Valar begrudged to Middle-earth the light. It trickles down. This is part of our conversation earlier about the position of Telperion and Laurelin on Azellahar to the west of Valmar, right? Because had they put the trees at the top of Taniquetil, things would have been very different. Fëanor would not have been able to make this argument, but we can kind of get the sense that the light was being hoarded because it was a defensive position. That defensive position has now proved to be completely insufficient, thanks to Ungoliant, but it is still a defensive position nonetheless. And a defensive position can always feel a little bit, can almost inescapably feel a little bit like a prison. And is there a comparison to be drawn here between the Valar, shrouded by the Pelori, crouching hidden behind the Pelori from the ravages of Melkor in Middle-earth, and, for example, Ungoliant, right? Kind of deep in the crevice, deep in the crack of the rock there in Avathar, hiding from the light. Kind of, is there always an argument that to be in retreat too long makes you weaker, that it deprives you of something? So here, Fëanor makes that argument, and then with quite the ambition of rhetorical purpose here, calls Cuivanen, right? Remember Cuivanen, where we awoke, where we began? I, of course, myself have never been there and have never seen it because I was born right here in Valinor, says Fëanor, by implication. But in Cuivanen, sweet ran the waters under unclouded stars, and wide lands lay about where a free people might walk. There they lay still and await us, who in our folly forsook them. Not me, of course. I wasn't born there. I was born here, so I never forsook them. But he's making this grand statement to all of the Noldor. He's embodying the spirit of his people as a king would. He is speaking as the Noldori, right? He is speaking of the guy in the chair right now. Long he spoke, and ever urged the Noldor to follow him, and by their own prowess to win freedom and great realms in the land of the East. We have been kept for too long prisoners here of the Valar, and we shall... Oh, and of course, many of the Eldar heard then for the first time of the aftercomers too. Most of the Eldar, you'll remember, do not know about the coming of men because the Valar didn't tell them about the second race of the children of Iluvatar, the second type, species, the second children of Iluvatar, the aftercomers, right? But Melkor has told them. He has told them the truth, kind of, but he has allowed that story to take on a weight and an implication, an intention that is beyond the actual literal truth at this point. But you'll notice what happens to Fëanor's rhetoric here, right? Vengeance calls me hence, but even were it otherwise, I would not dwell longer in the same land with the kin of my father's slayer and the thief of my treasure, right? Vengeance calls me forth. I am going out. After Morgoth, to the ends of the earth. War we shall have and hatred undying, but when we have conquered and regained the Silmarils... Damn, he said the quiet part loud. There's no vengeance there. I mean, of course, there is implied vengeance, right? When we have conquered, yes, implied vengeance. When Morgoth is slain, yes, but not when we have conquered and avenged my father, your king. We're not saying that part. When we have conquered and regained the Silmarils, then we and we alone shall be lords of the unsullied light and lords of the unsullied light. He's obviously echoing the talking points of Melkor as we move through this entire discussion, but here he's replicating the language, and not just the language, but the underlying intent too. I want the light for myself. No other race shall oust us. It's a bad scene. It's a bad scene. But it's also not the worst scene that we're going to get, because on top of this, he's going to make an oath. And the oath, well, let's get to it. Then Fëanor swore a terrible oath. His 7 sons leapt straightway to his side and took the self-same vow together, and red as blood shone their drawn swords in the glare of the torches. They swore an oath which none shall break and none should take, by the name even of Iluvatar, calling the everlasting dark upon them if they kept it not, and Manwë they named in witness, and Varda, and the hallowed mountain of Taniquetil, vowing to pursue with vengeance and hatred to the ends of the world, Vala, demon, elf, or man as yet unborn, or any creature, great or small, good or evil, that time should bring forth into the end of days, whoso should hold or take or keep a Silmaril from their possession. Thus spoke Maithros and Maglor and Celegorm, Curufin and Curinthir, Amrod and Amras, princes of the Noldor, and many quailed to hear the dread words. For so sworn, good or evil, an oath may not be broken, and it shall pursue oathkeeper and oathbreaker to the world's end. Fingolfin and Turgon his son therefore spoke against Fëanor, and fierce words awoke, so that once again wrath came near to the edge of swords. But Finarfin spoke softly, as was his wont, and sought to calm the Noldor, persuading them to pause and ponder ere deeds were done that could not be undone. And Orodreth, alone of his sons, spoke in like manner. Finrod was with Turgon his friend, but Galadriel, the only woman of the Noldor to stand that day tall and valiant among the contending princes, was eager to be gone. No oaths she swore, but the words of Fëanor concerning Middle-earth had kindled in her heart, for she yearned to see the wide, unguarded lands, and to rule there a realm of her own will. Of like mind with Galadriel was Fingon, Fingolfin's son, being moved also by Fëanor's words, though he loved him little. And with Fingon stood as they ever did Angrod and Aegnor, sons of Finarfin. But these held their peace and spoke not against their fathers. So much here to unpack. Let's begin with Galadriel, just because this is probably the point of her greatest prominence in the pages of the Silmarillion, and this is the story which unfolds all the way to her temptation of the ring, right? This is all the way to Frodo offering her the ring near the end of the Fellowship of the Ring. This story, this kindling within her of a desire of a land of her own, is what ultimately leads her to Middle-earth. It is what ultimately leads to the creation of Lothlorien, and it's it's interesting to see how Tolkien navigates the specifics here, right? Because Fëanor's giving this huge, terrible, declamatory oath, and his sons are swearing it with their swords raised in the torchlight, right? The only light that is now here, the distant stars above, sure, but the light that is immediate is the red light of the torches, the light like blood of the torches. Tying back to our discussion last week about red and red light being associated with Fëanor. You'll remember the plumes on their helmets, of course, as well. So here they take this oath that is not about freedom, that is just about the Silmarils, right? That is the purpose of the terrible oath, which we'll break down in just a moment. And Galadriel hears this and is in some sense inspired, not necessarily inspired to hatred or fear or even suspicion of the Valar, not even necessarily roused to a fear of the awakening of men, right? And the coming of the second children of Iluvatar, but desirous of a land of her own. And in that moment, I think that we can see the crucial kind of moral cleft, the moral conundrum that defines Galadriel's story from here until the end of her tale, right? Which I guess not actually the end of the Fellowship of the Ring, but the end of the Return of the King, when she passes into the West, when she actually passes into the West, rather than just saying that she will pass into the West and remain Galadriel. She is caught between this desire for dominion and the desire of a gardener. She wants to create a landscape, a place, a region, a home that is hers, which, as we've talked about, is a noble sentiment. We love gardeners in Tolkien's Legendarium, but also there comes with that a very tempting kind of dominion, a very tempting kind of rulership, of ownership, and that can be bad. And that really is the dynamic that sets in motion all of Galadriel's story. We will get the opportunity to talk a little more about her. And it's becoming increasingly obvious that at some point very soon we're going to return to the pages of The Lord of the Rings and just talk more about everything that happens there through the lens of the Silmarillion, because it really does become just a completely different reading experience. So let's look at this oath, right? Then Fëanor swore a terrible oath. His 7 sons leapt straightway to his side and took the self-same vow together, and red as blood shone their drawn swords, in the glare of the torches. They swore an oath which none shall break and none should take, right? Do not break this oath. Do not take this oath. As we see here, oath keepers and oath breakers, right, will both be haunted by these words. It doesn't matter if the oath is good or bad. or how can I put that? It does matter if the oath is good or bad. This is a very bad oath. It doesn't matter if the oath is kept or broken. That is not what distinguishes goodness and badness in this question, right? The nature of this oath itself is so terrible that even if you keep it, calamity shall befall you, right? Death and destruction will follow. For so sworn, good or evil, an oath may not be broken, and it shall pursue oathkeeper and oathbreaker to the world's end. And what is the nature of this oath? They call upon Iluvatar, calling the everlasting dark upon them if they kept it not, right? To be exiled from creation, right? The everlasting dark here kind of is in denial of the flame imperishable. Here, as they are surrounded by firelight, they are challenging the everlasting dark to take them if they break this oath. Manwë they named in witness Varda and Taniquetal, right? The most sacred things, the greatest beings, the greatest words that they can use to sanctify this oath that they are taking. Vowing to pursue. So this is what it is. This is where we get down to it. To pursue with vengeance and hatred to the ends of the world, Vala, demon, elf, or man as yet unborn, or any creature great or small, good or evil, that time should bring forth unto the end of days, whoso should hold or take or keep a Silmaril from their possession. Nothing here about Finwë. Nothing here about vengeance upon the murder of Fëanor's father. This is just about the Silmarils. And it includes all categories of being, right? To pursue with vengeance and hatred. Not just to pursue with vengeance, not just to pursue with a sense of justice, not just to right wrongs here, but to pursue with hatred to the ends of the world. Vala, demon, elf, or man as yet unborn. All categories of being, great or small, good or evil, that time should bring forth into the end of days, whoso should hold or take or keep a Silmaril from their possession. This is the statement of greed, of the ultimate form of jealousy, that the Silmarils are more important than anything else. And then we get the accounting, of course, of all the various sons, but we'll have time to talk about that as we move into the events that follow hereafter. At length, after long debate, Fëanor prevailed, and the greater part of the Noldor there assembled, he set aflame with the desire of new things and strange countries. Therefore, when Finarfin spoke yet again for heed and delay, a great shout went up, "Nay, let us be gone!" And straightway Fëanor and his sons began to prepare for the marching forth. Little foresight could there be for those who dared to take so dark a road. Yet all was done in overhaste, for Fëanor drove them on, fearing lest in the cooling of their hearts his words should wane and other counsels yet prevail. For all his proud words he did not forget the power of the Valar. But from Valmar no message came, and Manwë was silent. He would not yet either forbid or hinder Fëanor's purpose, for the Valar were aggrieved that they were charged with evil intent to the Eldar, or that any were held captive by them against their will. Now they watched and waited, for they did not yet believe that Fëanor could hold the host of the Noldor to his will. So Fëanor does what so many people do when they have a moment of a bullying and hectoring rhetorical victory, which is to act fast. Because if everybody cools down, if temper is cool, then people are going to start asking questions, and I don't have answers to all of those questions, so we got to go right now. Little foresight could there be for those who dare to take so dark a road. So even under the best of circumstances, if you undertake a path like this, you're going to have a difficult time. But it's all the worse for Fëanor because all is done in overhaste. Fëanor drove them on, fearing lest in the cooling of their hearts his words should wane and other counsels yet prevail. But again, the Valar prove themselves, right? We've already seen this. Mando says, okay, you don't want to give up the Silmarils? Okay. Here again, they don't intervene. Manwë does nothing to stop the Noldor from leaving Aman because he never intended to do anything to stop the Noldor from leaving Aman. Once again, Fëanor's rhetoric, his argument here is proven to be a hollow thing, a creation of Morgoth and a dark impulse from the gossiping Noldor in the days before the darkening of Valinor. So we depart. We prepare ourselves here and head north. I will note here Finarfin speaking yet again for heed and delay. Finarfin again being a very cool head. The sons of Finwë are good dudes. Fëanor accepted, right? Fingolfin has this fundamental decency, this honesty, this directness of thought and of deed. And Finarfin too is a wiser head for counsel than Fëanor is. But Fëanor is the king, at least in part, right? Yeah, exactly. Glorfin David says, right, how far into their march can they continue to hold on to such strong negative feelings? But that's the thing. Once you're on the road, you're pot committed, right? You can maybe build narratives as you're moving. You can tell more stories. You don't have, and it's clear here when Fëanor is talking about these other councils, he's talking about the Valar, right? We get that. For all his proud words, he did not forget the power of the Valar. He's not necessarily thinking of the councils of Finarfin or the councils of Fingolfin or the councils of cooler heads among the Noldor than his own. Yeah, but certainly at least we'll be away from the Valar and they won't intervene, which makes it clear, I suppose, that he does believe that they would. It's clear to us that the Valar have never imprisoned the Eldar, but maybe to Fëanor he is caught up. He's so caught up in the lies of Melkor that he, to some extent, believes it. Though again, and always, I would bring it back to the Silmarils rather than anything else. Okay. And indeed, when Fëanor began the marshalling of the Noldor for their setting out, then at once dissension arose. For though he had brought the assembly in a mind to depart, by no means all were of a mind to take Fëanor as king. Greater love was given to Fingolfin and his sons, and his household and the most part of the dwellers in Tirion refused to renounce him, if he would go with them. And thus at the last, as two divided hosts, the Noldor set forth upon their bitter road. Fëanor and his following were in the van, but the greater host came behind under Fingolfin, and he marched against his wisdom because Fingon his sons so urged him, and because he would not be sundered from his people that were eager to go, nor leave them to the rash counsels of Fëanor. Nor did he forget his words before the throne of Manwë. With Fingolfin went Finarfin also, and for like reasons, but most loath was he to depart. And of all the Noldor and Valinor, who were grown now to a great people, but one tithe refused to take the road. Some for the love that they bore to the Valar, and to Aule not least. Some for the love of Tirion and the many things that they had made. None for fear of peril by the way. But even as the trumpet sang and Fëanor issued from the gates of Tirion, a messenger came at last from Manwë, saying, Against the folly of Fëanor shall be set my counsel only. Go not forth. For the hour is evil, and your road leads to sorrow that you do not yet foresee. No aid will the Valar lend you in this quest, but neither will they hinder you. For this ye shall know, as ye came hither freely, freely shall ye depart. But thou, Fëanor Finwë's son, by thine oath art exiled. The lies of Melkor thou shalt unlearn in bitterness. Vala he is, thou sayest. Then thou hast sworn in vain, for none of the Valar canst thou overcome now or ever within the halls of Ea. Not through Ero, whom thou namest, has made thee thrice greater than thou art. So, Fëanor has the advantage. He's got first mover advantage here as we begin to depart from Tirion upon Tuna. But there's already dissent among the other elves. Fingolfin doesn't want to go. He doesn't think that this is wise. And more importantly, Fingolfin's people, his family and his community, his segment of the Noldor here, they want him to be king. They don't bear for Fëanor the same love that they bear for Fingolfin. And let's remember that Fingolfin has been king in Tirion for quite a while now, because Fëanor was exiled and Finwë went to Formenost too, right? He went off to spend his time with his eldest son, for reasons which we can only kind of look at dubiously, I suppose. So Fingolfin has been the king and is well respected by his people. So he goes with Fëanor because he can't allow his people to be split. Nor did he forget his words before the throne of Manwë, right? Half brothers in blood, full brothers in heart. That's what he's talking about there. That's the oath that he made in effect to Fëanor in front of Manwë at Taniquetil, right before the darkening of Valinor. Then Finarfin also kind of feels the same way. He doesn't want his people to be riven. He doesn't want his people to be left under Fëanor's command. So he goes too, but is most loath to depart. So we've got Fëanor's people in the van, right, in the front of the march. Once again, we're seeing elves kind of separate themselves out as they're undertaking a long journey. So we've got Fëanor's folks up front, and then we've got Fingolfin and Finarfin's people under the rule of Fingolfin following along thereafter. And of all the Noldor and Valinor, who were grown now to a great people, but one tithe refused to take the road. That's 1/10. So 9 out of every 10 Noldor just left Tirion upon Tuna and started heading out. And only 1/10 remained because of the love that they bore to the Valar and to Aule, some for the love of Tirion and many things that they had made. And this is crucial, and I love the inclusion of this. None for fear of peril, by the way. Not one single elf stayed in Tirion upon Tuna because they were scared of the journey. They only stayed because they loved the things here more than they loved the thought and the promise of Middle-earth over the sea. It's a really powerful moment. And then we get the actual Council of Manwë, right? We're not going to stop you. We're not going to help you if anything bad happens. This is a super bad idea. But most importantly, right? No, we'll do the, yes. But thou, Fëanor Finwë's son, specifically, just Fëanor, right? By thine oath art exiled. The lies of Melkor thou shalt unlearn in bitterness. Vala he is, thou sayest. Oh, you got this whole problem staying here because we are kin with Melkor? well, you're right. And guess what? You could not beat Melkor. You could not beat any of the Valar, even if you were 3 times greater than you are right now. This is a fool's errand. You are making a bad choice. And I don't think that this is maybe the smartest thing that Manwë could have done. There's basically nothing that Manwë could do at this point that would not throw more fuel on the fire of the Noldor, right? That would not better play to Fëanor's case than this exactly. Oh, you think that we're the kin of Melkor? Well, guess what? We are. And you can't beat him, and you can't beat us. Also, you're exiled forever. Peace. Maybe not the strategy. Maybe we should let, I don't know, someone else handle this. I can't help but feel that maybe Yavanna would have done a better job, or Aule. You know, Aule would have been a great choice for this ambassadorial position. We could have sent someone out who could have maybe managed expectations a little stronger there. But all of this is, well, let's get, in fact, to the response to Manwë, and then we're going to get to one of the darkest moments in the entire Silmarillion. But Fëanor laughed and spoke not to the herald, but to the Noldor, saying, "So, then will this valiant people send forth the heir of their king alone into banishment with his sons only, and return to their bondage? But if any will come with me, I say to them, is sorrow foreboded to you? But in Aman we have seen it. In Aman we have come through bliss to woe. The other now we will try, through sorrow to find joy, or freedom at the least." Then turning to the herald, he cried, "Say this to Manwë Sulimo, High King of Arda. If Fëanor cannot overthrow Morgoth, at least he delays not to assail him, and sits not idle in grief. And it may be that Eru has set in me a fire greater than thou knowest. Such hurt at the least will I do to the foe of the Valar, that even the mighty in the ring of doom shall wonder to hear it. Yea, in the end they shall follow me. Farewell." In that hour the voice of Fëanor grew so great and so potent that even the herald of the Valar bowed before him as one full answered, and departed. And the Noldor were overruled. Therefore they continued their march, and the house of Fëanor hastened before them along the coasts of Elendë. Not once did they turn their eyes back to Tirion on the green hill of Tuna. Slower and less eagerly came the host of Fingolfin after them. Of those Fingon was the foremost, but at the rear went Finarfin and Finrod, and many of the noblest and wisest of the Noldor, and often they looked behind them to see the fair city, under the lamp of the Mindin Adalieva, was lost in the night. More than any of the others of the exiles, they carried thence memories of the bliss that they had forsaken, and some even of the things that they had made there they took with them, a solace and a burden on the road. And so the Noldor depart. You see the rhetorical strategy from Fëanor here now too. Ha! I have been exiled? Who among the Noldor, these fine and valiant people, would let me be exiled by myself? Are you not going to come with me now? And then the response to Manwë. Say this to Manwë Sulimo, High King of Arda. I'm going to do it. I'm going to be so great. You don't even know how great I am. And one day I'm going to be so great that even you are going to hear about it. And that's going to be a bad day for you. Laters. In that hour, the voice of Fëanor grew so great and so potent that even the herald of the Valar bowed before him as one full answer. Like, even the herald is like, no, okay, excellent point. Excellent. I'll go back to Manwë and tell him what you said. Thanks so much. And the Noldor are overruled and thus continue their march. Fëanor, once again, this firebrand leader, he gets his opportunity to exercise this rhetoric. Would this have happened if Manwë hadn't sent that herald? Well, it's difficult to be sure, right? But, and again, we are really here in these greatest and most tragic moments of Tolkien's Legendarium, constantly, of course, rubbing up against the inevitability of eucatastrophe. The idea that these things are going to happen in the worst way possible so that the greatest goodness can flow forth. That it could have been different, but it couldn't have been better, ultimately, right? Can we condemn Manwë for his tactless missive to Fëanor? Maybe, from some senses, yes. I think in some ways we probably can. I think we can see that it fails to understand Fëanor's psychology. I find it very difficult to imagine a world in which Fëanor heeds Manwë's counsel, and goes off by himself and lets the other Noldor return to Tirion upon Tuna. But maybe there's some world in which that would happen. But much more likely, to my mind, is this firebrand response and the recommitment of the Noldor to their flight. And we have this really gorgeous kind of diaspora happening in miniature here as we see, the house of Fëanor taking the lead, being in the van, heading for, not like the, Honda Odyssey or whatever, but like in the lead as they are traveling north here out of out of Tyrion, but also the other elves tailing along behind, right? Fingon was the foremost, but at the rear were Fëanor and Finrod, and many of the noblest and wisest of the Noldor, and often they looked behind them to see their fair city under the lamp of the Minden Adalieva until, the lamp of the Minden Adalieva was lost in the night. There's tragedy here. These people don't really want to leave. They're leaving because there's a commitment here to kinship more than anything else. And that emphasis on kinship is crucially important. It's so important that right now Tolkien is establishing these bonds of blood between these people, right? Out of their own counsel, they would not go. Out of their own counsel, they would not follow Fëanor, right? Many of Fingolfin's people would not take Fëanor as their king, but still they go because of the bond of blood, because of the oath made by Fingolfin in front of Manwë, right? Half brother in blood, full brother in heart. That's the commitment that he has made. And that is so important because we're going to get to Aqualonde. Now, Fëanor led the Noldor northward because his first purpose was to follow Morgoth. Moreover, Tuna beneath Taniquetil was set nigh in the girdle of Arda, and there the great sea was immeasurably wide. Whereas ever northward, the sundering seas grew narrower, as the wasteland of Araman and the coasts of Middle-earth drew together. But as the mind of Fëanor cooled and took counsel, he perceived overlate that all these great companies would never overcome the long leagues to the north, nor cross the seas at the last, save with the aid of ships. Yet it would need long time and toil to build so great a fleet, even were there any among the Noldor skilled in that craft. He resolved now, therefore, to persuade the Teleri, ever friends to the Noldor, to join with them. And in his rebellion he thought that thus the bliss of Valinor might be further diminished, and his power for war upon Morgoth be increased. He hastened then to Aqualonde, and spoke to the Teleri as he had spoken before in Tyrion. But the Teleri were unmoved by aught that he could say. They were grieved indeed at the going of their kinsfolk and long friends, but would rather dissuade them than aid them. And no ship would they land, nor help in the building against the will of the Valar. As for themselves, they desired now no other home but the strands of Eldamar, and no other lord than Olwe, prince of Aqualonde. And he had never lent ear to Morgoth, nor welcomed him to his land, and he trusted still that Ulmo and the other great among the Valar would redress the hurts of Morgoth, and that the night would pass yet to a new dawn. So you'll remember, these are the Falmari of the Teleri, right? This is the only branch of the Teleri who become Calaquendi, who come to Valinor and see the lights of the trees. Aqualonde is their city that they build. They have their fleet of swan boats in which they flit around the Bay of Eldamar, right? They've learned the knowledge of shipbuilding and ship crafting and of sailing too, ruled here by Olwe, who is the brother of Elwë, who got stranded in the forest with Melian back in Beleriand. More on him in the pages to come. We're going to catch up with what's been going on back in Beleriand, I promise you, in the pages to come. And you'll remember, too, Morgoth giving his account when he goes to the Noldor, right? He doesn't go to the Vanyar because they're all cozy with Manwë living on the slopes of Taniquetil itself. And he doesn't go to the Teleri because boat people, am I right? Just like sea folks, just like hanging out surfing and saying, bruh. Who has time for that? He only spreads his lies among the Noldor. But because they have never yet heard the lies of Melkor, Olwe and his people are not turned against the Valar. The rhetorical power of Fëanor here is insufficient in the face of A, the happy life that these Teleri have here on the shores of the Great Sea, and B, the fact that their faith in the Valar has never been shaken. It's never been brought into doubt by the lies and the toxicity of Melkor, of Morgoth, right? So they refused. The Teleri are unmoved by aught that he could say. They were grieved indeed at the going of the kinsfolk and long friends. This sucks. You guys are going you all the way back to Middle-earth. That's tough. But we would rather dissuade you than aid you. We are not going to give you ships. We are not going to show you how to build ships. We would really love for you to stay and hang out and maybe find a new place to live and maybe be here with us. Surf's up, brah. But no. We still have Olwe here trusting in Ulmo and the other great among the Valar that they would redress the hurts of Morgoth and that night would pass yet to a new dawn. Which is, of course, the path of wisdom, right? That is the idea that we can be... So often we see the quickening of hurt and of grief into anger. That is the surest route to disaster in the Legendarium, right? That is the what is it? Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate. Whatever the little the Sith mantra that we get from Star Wars. That's exactly played out here. But because there's no hatred here, because there's no suspicion here, because there's no gossip here, and they still have faith in the benevolence of the Valar, the Teleri are content. And that will be their downfall, unfortunately. Then Fëanor grew wrathful, for he still feared delay, and hotly he spoke to Olwe. "You renounce your friendship, even in the hour of our need," he said. "Yet you were glad indeed to receive our aid when you came at last to these shores, faint-hearted loiterers, and well-nigh empty-handed. In huts on the beaches would you be dwelling still, had not the Noldor carved out your haven and toiled upon your walls." But Olwe answered, "We renounce no friendship, but it may be the part of a friend to rebuke a friend's folly. And when the Noldor welcomed us and gave us aid, otherwise than you spoke, in the lands of Aman we were to dwell forever, as brothers whose houses stand side by side. But as far for our white ships, those you gave us not. We learned not that craft from the Noldor, but from the lords of the sea, and the white timbers we wrought with our own hands, and the white sails were woven by our wives and our daughters. Therefore we will neither give them nor sell them for any league or friendship. For I say to you, Fëanor, son of Finwë, these are to us as the gems of the Noldor, the work of our hearts, whose like we shall not make again." And it's impossible to read Fëanor's sensitivity to this. It's impossible to get a clean read on whether or not he understands what it is that Olwe is saying. And certainly, it's not at all clear what Olwe knows of the situation. Does Olwe know about the Silmarils? Like, does he really know about the Silmarils? Maybe. Has he seen the Silmarils? Probably not. Everything we hear about the Teleri is that they just hang out at Aqualonde. They hang out, on the shore, and they can see the lights of Valinor if they want to, but they often don't want to, and they love the starlit sky, and they're just having a great time there. But he's clearly echoing Fëanor's earlier language, right? Yes, okay, yes. When we showed up, firstly, calm yourself, calm your argument here. You were glad indeed to receive our aid when you came to these shores, faint-hearted loiterers and well-nigh empty-handed, says Fëanor, right? And always says, hey, okay, look, yes, you helped us build our city. Thanks very much for that. You did that because you love building. Let's not forget that, because the works of your hands and so on and so forth. But you didn't help us build our boats. You neither helped us directly nor taught us how to do it. This is our craft. These are our creation. These are the things in which we have spent our skill and our souls. These are the things that we have imbued with our significance, right? This is the craft of our making that cannot be replicated within the halls of Ea. This is our one shot. These are the Silmarils of the Teleri. These are the two trees of Valinor of the Teleri. They built their swan boats, and they're not going to be replicated. The work of our hearts, whose like we shall not make again. He's telling Fëanor exactly what he should, whether he knows it or not. He's telling Fëanor exactly the thing that should get through to Fëanor. He's telling Fëanor the thing that should halt him in his wrath and in his fury. But with every step, Fëanor is compounding the poor decisions that he's already made, and he's being more and more consumed by his wrath. Which leads us to the kinslaying of Aqualonde. Thereupon Fëanor left him, and sat in dark thought beyond the walls of Aqualonde until his host was assembled. When he judged that his strength was enough, he went to the haven of the swans and began to man the ships that were anchored there and to take them away by force. But the Teleri withstood him and cast many of the Noldor into the sea. Then swords were drawn, and a bitter fight was fought upon the ships, and about the lamplit quays and piers of the haven, and even upon the great arch of its gate. Thrice the people of Fëanor were driven back, and many were slain upon either side. But the vanguard of the Noldor were succoured by Fingon and the foremost of the host of Fingolfin, who coming up found a battle joined and their own kin falling, and rushed in before they knew rightly the cause of the quarrel. Some thought indeed that the Teleri had sought to waylay the march of the Noldor at the bidding of the Valar. Thus at last the Teleri were overcome, and a great part of their mariners that dwelt in Aqualonde were wickedly slain. For the Noldor were become fierce and desperate, and the Teleri had less strength, and were armed for the most part but with slender bows. Then the Noldor drew away their white ships, and manned their oars as best they could, and rowed them north along the coast. And Olwe called upon Ose, but he came not, for it was not permitted by the Valar that the flight of the Noldor should be hindered by force. But Rhiannon wept for the mariners of the Teleri, and the sea rose in wrath against the slayers, so that many of the ships were wrecked, and those in them drowned. Of the kinslaying at Aqualonde more is told in the lament which is named the Noldolante, the fall of the Noldor, that Maglor made ere he was lost. So this is the other reference to a paratext that does not exist, right? To another document that supplements this that does not exist for exactly the same purpose as the Darkening of Valinor itself. This is a great story. It is a terrible event. It is a thing that deserves a full and complete history, a full account of these events, but we're not going to give you that account here because that document already exists, because it is the Noldolante, the fall of the Noldor. And how specific and beautiful and tragic it is to even position this rhetorically as the fall of the Noldor, not the slaying of the Teleri. not the first kinslaying of all the elves. This is the first time that an elf has shed the blood of another elf, right? We've had Fëanor threatening Fingolfin, and we have had the death of Finwë at Morgoth's hand, but this is the first time that one elf has killed another. It's the first of 3 kinslayings which will occur in the history of Middle-earth, and though, I don't know, I think maybe by some measure it's the least of the 3, it is, I think, inescapably the most tragic. I think it is inescapably the moment at which the Noldor fall, and thus the title of this history. The history written by Maglor, lest we forget, is perfectly named, the Noldorlante, the fall of the Noldor. So Fëanor broods, he leads his forces back into the Haven of the Swans, right? Aqualonde, Swan Haven here. And they just begin by taking the ships. That's maybe something very tiny for Fëanor's credit. They just begin by stealing the ships. That's his plan here, is to steal the ships such as the Silmarils were stolen from him. Though again, we have no sense of his consciousness of that fact here, the irony of that fact here. The Teleri withstand them. Swords are drawn, and the bitter fight over the lamplit quays and piers, even on the great arch of its gate. Do you remember when we heard about the creation of Aqualonde, that the portal to the harbor is this arch of living rock up against the sea, so the harbor beyond is sheltered from the ocean? It's a beautiful thought. It's a beautiful idea, but here, yeah, sullied with blood. And then we get the compounding fault here, right? That the Noldor are succored by Fingon and the foremost of the host of Fingolfin, who arrive late, see the battle going, and think, oh my God, the Valar have told the Teleri to stop us from leaving. 2 arms, man, 2 arms. And thus, this original sin of arrogance, of hubris, of wrath, right, is compounded again and again. It just keeps happening. And then Olwe calls upon Ose, but always words fall on deaf ears, right? You'll remember that he doesn't call to Ulmo here, he calls to Ose. But the Valar have said that the Maiar may also not prevent the flight of the Noldor. So Ose is not going to get caught up in this, right? Ose, you'll remember, is the Maiar in the service of Ulmo, who controls like the currents and the coastal waters, right? And Weenan is the salt water. She is the one that calms Ose. But here she is the one that is grief-racked, right? She is the one that is stricken. She weeps for the mariners of the Teleri, and the sea rises in wrath against the slayers, so that many of the ships were wrecked and those in them drowned. So even after Fëanor has taken the boats, even after some significant fraction of his troops have fallen at Aqualonde, he takes the boats, and then the sea itself rises up against them. I don't know how far you need to go down this road before you realize that you're the bad guy, is all. And with that, I think what we're going to do then is, as you can hear, I'm sure, my voice is kind of coming a little unstuck, and we're almost at 2 hours. So I think we're going to call it there, because then we're going to get into the doom of the Noldor. We're going to get into Mandos's declaration of what is about to happen to the Noldor and what will continue to happen to the Noldor for the rest of recorded history. It's extremely powerful stuff. And the layers of irony here, you know, we did talk last week and even a little today about the rhyming structure that Tolkien brings to his work, that he recapitulates these stories in a different form, at a lower register. He brings them back, and we see the same stories kind of play out again and again. I don't think that there's a spot in the Silmarillion where we see those stories play out so closely, so that they overlap, so that we just see the same things happening over and over and over, and this descent into tragedy that is kindled by this original, this original intervention of Melkor, right? The marring of Arda here again. Yeah. Yes, so Gladrebeki says, so what caused the sea to rise? Her weeping or the sea's own will? This is a great question, because what you're getting at there, Gladrebeki, is the actual power of the Maiar, right? What is the nature of their dominion? What is the nature of their role in Arda itself? And to some extent, the Valar too, right? Again, not different categories of being. They kind of have the same sense. So does Weenan, does her weeping, her grief, her sorrow cause the sea to rise, or is the sea rising a product of her sorrow, right? Is it one and the same? Is she the sea? Or let me temper that a little bit. Is she connected bodily? Bodily is bad. Is she connected in her essence to the sea? Is it a is there a co-positioning, the one over the other, right? Is there a superimposition of Uinen so that she is kind of categorically the same as the coastal water, as the waves, as the ocean itself? It's unclear. We don't really get a sense. There are times when we get a sense, right? There are times when we understand, I think, Orome to be the Valar of the hunt, right? He is the huntsman of the Valar, but he's not, like, in a real sense, the spirit of hunting. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think that he is an agent in the world more so than some of the other Valar are. Tulkas, for example, also an agent in the world. Is Lorien? Is Mandos? Mandos is really interesting because it does seem as though Mandos is inextricably tied to, you know, his domain of judgment and the act of judging are one and the same thing, that his words are empowered by his position, by his purpose. It's a difficult thing to track down. Do we think metaphorically that Uinen is so large and so powerful that it's actually tears, that it's actually the weeping of Uinen that causes the tides to crash and causes the waves to claim the swan boats of Aqualonde? I don't know. I don't literally know how we are supposed to interpret that. My guess, my inclination would be much more the former. My guess would be much more that she doesn't consciously cause the seas to rise, but rather in her grief the seas rise. Do you know what I mean? I think we're getting some kind of consonance there. That co-positioning of Maya and dominion in a sense. Yeah, or is the sea rising a kind of natural reaction of the world itself to evil? That's really interesting. That's a really interesting question, Becky. You know, I was caught earlier by the passage about the fogs coming up off of the ocean in the aftermath of the darkening of Valinor, and now the world is itself just more meager, and the world itself is more aggressive or more. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I'm going to get to the heart of this. That's a really, really interesting question. I would love to spend some more time thinking about how the natural world responds to acts of evil, because normally the world as it's presented to us, right, our environment, our local environment as it's presented to us in Tolkien, is so much more influenced by the product of the actions and presence of those within it, right? Like, there is a real sense, a kind of inescapable sense, that the Shire is beautiful and fertile and gentle and peaceful because of the presence of the hobbits, rather than the hobbits settling there because of the natural qualities of the Shire. A little bit of column A and a little bit of column B, certainly, but much more column A, much more like the good people of the Shire make the Shire a good place. Contrast that with Mirkwood, right? Contrast that with the presence of the necromancer at Dol Guldur, with the spiders of Mirkwood, with the absenteeism of Thranduil and the elves of the woodland realm there. And I think that you can see, I mentioned before, the desolation of Smaug, right, is a perfect example of this. That is not a desolate area prior to the arrival of Smaug, but his presence, not even his action in that space, but his presence in that space has corrupted the landscape. And those, I think, are the ways in which we see that interaction in The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion by extension too, is that the landscape is more of a blank slate. We tend not... I'm really racking my brain trying to think of examples where we can really like fold in the notion of the pathetic fallacy, right? Where we can fold in the notion that the emotions and experiences of those who are witnessing these events or those who are causing these events trigger a response in the natural world around them. Possibly the Rock'em Sock'em robot fights as we're crossing the Misty Mountains in the pages of The Hobbit, right? The storm giant fight, the metaphorical stone giant fight, in The Hobbit perhaps could be seen as something of that. But even then, we're so disconnected from, you know, the Hobbit / Dwarvish experience of these mountains and the grandeur of the mountains themselves. There's something innate to them at that point. I guess the Old Forest to some extent too, right? We can see, although you can argue again that is part corruption and part the balance that we see between the good orderly lands of the Shire and the remnant of this ancient old forest that extends all the way up to the old forest on the east side of the Shire. Yeah, I think that my gut instinct here would be that it is Uinen's grief that is causing the sea to rise because, in a sense, she is the sea, right? She is the coastal water. That is her domain. In the same way that Does Manwë cause the winds to blow clear the belched vapors of Ungoliant and to clear the air above Valinor in the aftermath of Melkor's attack? Or does that happen because Manwë is simply, in some sense, the spirit of air, right? Is it a conscious thought, or is it just a thing that happens? See, but that metaphor breaks down too, because Aule, right? When Aule is engaged in his domain, in his sphere of power and of influence, he clearly is consciously doing the things that he's supposed to be doing. Is Nienna? How does that work? Yeah, I don't know. How does that work for Nesse or for Nessa, excuse me, or for Vana? Come to that, right? The Valar who are associated with youth and beauty, is there a sense in which they are consciously and actively doing youth and beauty in the world, or is it just a quality that they possess? I don't know. But again, my instinct here would be to assume that there's not a conscious act of destruction taking place here, but rather it is a consequence of the grief of Uinen at seeing the slaughter of the Teleri and the theft of the boats too. Yeah, very tied to the Falmari there, the Teleri of Olwe and Aqualonde. That is going to do it for this week's episode of Stars and Swords. Next week then, well, next week we're going to do our level best to talk about the Doom of the Noldor, to talk about Mandos's judgment that we're about to get, and then to move into chapters 10 and 11 of the Sindar and of the Sun and Moon and the Hiding of Valinor, which is going to be a very important chapter to get to. We'll try and get through all of those. We may end up just doing the end of this chapter and then chapter 10 next week, but I'll see how we go. Maybe we'll do it. I'm very pleased and proud, in fact, that we've got to session 8 of the Silmarillion series before the wheels have really come off the schedule that I so ambitiously undertook right back at the beginning. I should have listened to better counsel. I should have paused and let cooler heads prevail and listened to Fingolfin and maybe add an extra couple weeks into the scale here. That is going to do it, though, for this week's episode of Stars and Swords. Thank you all so much for joining me. Oh, one thing I will say is that next week's show will also be Sunday afternoon. It might be a little earlier in the day. I casually moved this week's show to Sunday just because I've been saying from the beginning that I want to kind of move it around in the schedule, allow some different people to listen live, allow some different people to come and hang out. I completely forgot that next week I have no choice and it has to be on Sunday. So we're going to do back-to-back Sundays, you guys, and then we'll probably move back to our regular Thursday schedule for a few weeks thereafter. Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you so much for hanging out with me, Gladrebecky and Glorfin David. It's been so good to see you here. I hope you have all enjoyed this week's episode and that you'll join me again next week for more. If you would like to support everything that I do here at Nextword, patreon.com/nextword is the place to go do that. And if you're listening to episode 8 in the Silmarillion series, you've heard me give this speech before, so I'm not going to give it again, except to say thank you so much to everyone who's pledged their support over there and comes to hang out. And if you are somehow listening to this for the first time, do head over and follow that Patreon page for free, patreon.com/nextword, because that's the place where you get the link to the live show every week. So you can come and hang out and talk and ask questions and send me down wild tangents, which is, let's all be honest, the best part of this endeavor. Thank you so much for listening. I will talk to you all again next week. Until then, stay safe. Take care. Bye.